Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The world announces itself to children through sound before it teaches them to see. For Thomas, the first true memory is not of his mother's face or his father's house, but of a man's voice, rough as wool, seasoned with laughter, singing about a maiden lost to the sea. He was perhaps 6 winters old, standing in the market square of Ashford with his older brother, when the minstrel passed through. The man wore a cloak patched in 3 colors, carried a lute strapped across his back like a soldier's shield, and moved through the crowd as though the cobblestones belonged to him more than to anyone permanent. The song lasted perhaps the length of time it took to milk a cow. When it ended, people scattered coins into a wooden bowl. The minstrel nodded to each giver with the gravity of a bishop accepting tithes. Thomas's brother tugged at their mother's sleeve, impatient for the market stalls where dried fruit waited. But Thomas remained fixed, watching the stranger pack the bowl into a satchel and stride toward the road leading eastward. That evening, he asked his mother what the man's name was. She did not know. This seemed to Thomas the most extraordinary fact about the encounter, that a person could be so entirely present and yet leave behind no footprint except the impression they made upon memory. His father, Edmund Ashford, was a cloth merchant of modest but respectable standing. The family occupied a house of timber and daub, neither poor nor grand, distinguished from its neighbors primarily by the quality of its shutters and the regularity with which the roof received attention. Edmund's trade took him to market towns across the Midlands, where he bought raw wool from farmers and sold finished cloth to drapers, innkeepers, and the occasional minor nobleman. It was steady work, demanding in its attention to quality and price, but it offered no room for spectacle or mystery. Edmund valued this. Spectacle, he believed, was the province of fools and charlatans. Thomas had 2 older brothers, William, who showed early aptitude for the family trade and was already being trained in the mathematics of profit and loss, and John, who had been apprenticed to a carpenter 3 years prior and now lived in a neighboring village. The hierarchy of sons in a merchant's household was not unlike the hierarchy of apprentices in a trade. One learned one's station early and did not question it. Thomas, being youngest and born after the family's fortunes had settled into comfortable predictability, was designated as a spare. A spare son meant options. He might learn his father's trade as backup to William. He might be apprenticed to another merchant's household, thereby establishing a profitable connection through marriage or partnership. Or, if he proved particularly clever, he might enter the church and secure the family's spiritual welfare, along with modest ecclesiastical advancement. None of these futures troubled Thomas in his early years, because he did not yet understand that futures could be imposed rather than discovered. He spent his childhood as most children in his station did, helping in the household, running errands to neighboring cottages, learning basic Latin from the priest, being occasionally struck for inattention or rudeness, and gradually absorbing the unspoken rules that governed a Christian merchant's son. He was not unhappy. Unhappiness in that time and place was a luxury that required leisure to properly cultivate. But between the ages of 7 and 10, something shifted in the texture of his attention. It began with a fascination with songs. Not the simple refrains that servants sang while working. He had always heard those, the way one hears rain. Rather, he became absorbed by the structure of storytelling through music, by the way a melody could make a listener remember details more vividly than any simple recitation, by the peculiar power of rhyme to make truth seem both more memorable and more beautiful than plain fact. He would sit outside taverns and listen to the traveling performers who appeared during market fairs. His mother indulged this, considering it a phase. His father tolerated it, considering it harmless. William regarded it with the faint contempt that the practically minded reserve for the aesthetically inclined. It was during the autumn of his 10th year that the man appeared again, or rather, a man appeared who seemed to Thomas to be the same man, though perhaps Thomas's memory had improved him with the passage of years. This second minstrel was less celebrated than the first, his cloak more thoroughly worn, his songs perhaps sung more frequently in village taverns than in marketplace squares. But to Thomas, who had been waiting without knowing it, this man represented an answer to a question he had not yet learned to ask. The minstrel's name was William, an ordinary name that seemed to Thomas impossibly dignified attached to this particular person. He had come to Ashford for the winter market, and he was lodging in the household of the blacksmith, working partially for his keep and partially for whatever coins he could gather. Thomas encountered him first at the blacksmith's forge, where he had been sent to collect nails. William was sitting on a bench outside, repairing a string on his lute, his fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. "You're watching closely," the man said, not looking up. Thomas, caught in the act of observation, felt the heat rise to his face. "I've never seen an instrument repaired." "Most haven't. Most people hear the sound and never wonder about the mechanism." William tested the string, adjusted something Thomas couldn't see, and began tuning. "They're right not to wonder. The mechanism is less important than the effect. But since you're wondering anyway, you might as well watch properly." This permission to observe, this legitimizing of curiosity, opened something in Thomas. He returned to the blacksmith's forge every day for a week, ostensibly on various errands, but really to sit near William and listen to fragments of conversation about music, about travel, about the different lords and ladies who hired performers for feast days, about the routes between villages and towns that a minstrel learned by heart, the way a merchant learns the prices of wool at different seasons. William did not speak much. He was parsimonious with conversation, generous with demonstration. He would play a passage, then play it again, altered slightly, inviting Thomas to notice the difference. He would sing a verse in a major key, then repeat it in a minor key, allowing the emotional shift to speak for itself. He did not explain the theory behind these things. There seemed to be an understanding between them that theory was for scholars, and they were not scholars. On the 8th day of this strange apprenticeship, William asked Thomas directly, "Do you want to learn?" Thomas, who had been trained since birth not to ask for things he was not entitled to, felt the question as both an opening and a trap. "My father wouldn't permit it." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you want to learn." The distinction seemed to Thomas both obvious and revolutionary. He wanted to learn more than he had wanted anything in his life thus far. Learning the cloth trade felt like inheriting a burden. Learning the carpenter's trade felt like accepting a station. But learning music felt like discovering a secret language that opened doorways in walls he had not previously noticed. "Yes," he said. "Then come to the smithy tomorrow evening, after your household has taken supper. Bring a length of cloth, something your father won't miss immediately, and we'll trade it for your first lesson. The smith is partial to good material for his wife's cloak. You'll frame it as having lost the cloth through carelessness. You'll do penance by helping in the household more diligently. Your father will judge the loss against the cost of replacing it and decide to let the matter rest. This is how these things are managed." Thomas did not question how William understood the psychology of merchant fathers, or how he was certain that this particular scheme would succeed. He simply knew that he was being offered a path that he had not previously imagined could exist. Not a choice between the merchant's life and the church, but a third way, shadowy and uncertain, that existed in the spaces between respectable choices. The next evening he took a length of cloth from his father's stock, a piece of undyed linen not so valuable as to cause serious anger, but valuable enough to require explanation, and made his way to the smithy after dark. William was waiting. Over the next 3 weeks, while William remained in Ashford, Thomas received instruction in the basics of the lute: how to hold it, how to finger the strings, how to distinguish between notes and rhythm, how to breathe while singing in order to maintain both melody and words. He was not naturally talented. His hands were too small initially, and they ached after even brief practice. His voice, when he attempted to sing, cracked in ways that seemed to him humiliating. But William was unmoved by these difficulties. "Talent is what people born to comfortable circumstances claim, so they needn't acknowledge their own practice," he said once, adjusting Thomas's hand position. "Work is what actually produces results. You'll work and you'll improve. Whether you become good enough to live by this trade depends on factors beyond either of us: your luck, your courage, the whims of lords and ladies. But I can teach you the mechanics. Whether you become a musician is partly your choice and partly fate's. This balance between agency and fortune, which would become a central preoccupation of Thomas's adult life, was first introduced to him in these winter weeks through the patient repetition of fingering exercises and the gradual expansion of his repertoire from single notes to simple melodies to actual songs, some of which William had composed and others which he had learned from other minstrels across Europe. The day came when William departed. Thomas knew it was coming. Winter had passed, spring was softening the roads, and a minstrel in a small market town had exhausted the demand for his services. But he was not prepared for the actuality of it. William left in the early morning, before the household was fully awake. He left a note with the blacksmith's wife, a scrap of parchment with 3 lines of music written in brown ink, and beneath it the words, "Practice these. The next one to teach you will come when you're ready." Thomas kept that scrap of parchment hidden in the thatch of the roof above his sleeping space for the next several years. He practiced the 3 lines of music until his fingers knew them without his mind's involvement, until he could play them while thinking of other things, until the notes became part of the landscape of his internal world, the way bird calls or wind patterns were part of the physical landscape. His father eventually discovered the lute, a cheap instrument that William had left behind, worth perhaps the value of 2 weeks' lodging. Edmund's reaction was neither as wrathful as Thomas had feared, nor as dismissive as the boy had initially hoped. Rather, it was complicated. Edmund saw in this evidence of his youngest son's independent action, a kind of cunning that he respected, even as he disapproved of the direction it had taken. "You've been dishonest," Edmund said after discovering the instrument. "You pretended to accept your station while secretly preparing for another. That's a form of cowardice." "Would you have permitted me to learn?" Thomas asked, surprising himself with his courage. "No," Edmund said, "precisely because learning would have led to this. A boy imagining himself capable of surviving without trade or position. But the fact that you asked yourself whether to risk my displeasure in pursuit of something you wanted, that shows something. It shows ambition, at least. Whether that ambition leads somewhere profitable or somewhere foolish remains to be seen." Edmund paused, running his fingers over the lute's body. "You'll continue your other studies. You'll continue learning the trade. But you may keep the instrument. If you're going to be a fool, you might as well be a complete one." This permission, qualified and grudging as it was, transformed everything. Over the following years, Thomas developed his skills in practiced solitude and in the shadowy space between his father's explicit disapproval and his tacit tolerance. He learned from other traveling musicians who passed through Ashford, trading small favors or portions of meals for instruction. He absorbed songs from servants and from tavern-goers. He practiced in the forest beyond the family's land, where his mistakes disturbed no one but the birds. By the time he reached his late teens, he had become competent enough that people would pause in their work to listen to him play. Competent enough that his father's friends occasionally asked him to perform at modest celebrations. Competent enough that he could imagine a life shaped around this skill, rather than around cloth and commerce. But he also understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with his parents' warnings, and everything to do with his own observations, that imagination and reality occupied different territories. He had seen the traveling musicians' worn cloaks and their careful attention to the price of bread. He had heard the stories they told about lords who hired them one season and did not call for them the next, about winters when work was scarce and cold was abundant, about the constant anxiety that underlay even their most cheerful performances. He understood that the freedom he associated with the minstrel's life was purchased at the price of precariousness, that the escape from his father's expectations would mean a perpetual negotiation with chance and the whims of others more powerful than himself. And yet, the alternative, remaining in Ashford, learning his father's trade thoroughly, inheriting the merchant's life of predictable calculation, seemed to him a different kind of precariousness, one that at least held the virtue of being familiar. He was caught in the tension between two futures, neither of which called to him entirely. The resolution came not through his deliberate choice, but through circumstance, which in Thomas's life would prove to be almost indistinguishable from choice. His father became ill in late winter of his 17th year, a fever that might have passed, but instead deepened into something more severe. He recovered after several weeks, but weakened. He lived for another 8 months, spending increasing amounts of time sitting quietly in a chair by the window, watching the street, as though counting the days remaining to him. Edmund died on a spring morning while Thomas was collecting water from the well. When Thomas returned to the house, his mother was waiting at the threshold with a particular expression on her face, not quite grief, not quite relief, but something between them. "You'll need to decide quickly," she said without preamble. "William is already making plans for you to join him in the trade. Your brother John thinks you should apprentice with a draper in the next town. Your oldest brother believes you should help me manage what remains of your father's business." Thomas stood with the water bucket in his hands, feeling the weight of it as though it represented the full burden of decision-making suddenly descended upon him. He thought of his father's final words to him, spoken the evening before the fever took a turn toward the fatal. "You'll make mistakes. The point is not to avoid them, that's impossible, but to survive them. Try to survive them in a way that leaves you room to try again." He set down the bucket carefully. "I'll go," he said, "to the road. I'll try the minstrel's life." His mother did not argue. She had already set aside a portion of her own dowry, money that legally belonged to her, but that tradition suggested she might gift to the children if circumstances warranted. She gave Thomas half of it, a sum that would sustain him through 2 seasons of modest expenses. She gave him also one thing that surprised him, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a piece of silver with a cross carved into it. "So that you remember this was not recklessness," she said. "So that you remember there were those here who believed in you." The parting with his brothers was less tender. William, now running the cloth trade competently if without his father's particular genius, regarded Thomas with something between pity and contempt. "You'll be back," he said, not unkindly. "When the roads grow cold and the work grows scarce, you'll be back. The family trade will be here if you decide to grow up." John, whom Thomas saw less frequently, simply embraced him. "Good luck," he said. "Try not to get yourself killed." Thomas left Ashford 3 days after his father's funeral in the company of a minstrel named Robert, who was passing through on his way to the east. He carried the lute, a change of clothes, a portion of bread and cheese, and a small collection of coins wrapped in cloth and sewn into the hem of his cloak. He was 17 years old, and the world announced itself again, not through the voice of a single performer in a market square, but through the simple fact of open road ahead, the weight of the lute on his back, and the knowledge that whatever came next would be the result of his own choosing, for better or for worse. Robert was a harder teacher than William had been, less patient and more cynical. He taught Thomas not only music, but also the practical mathematics of survival, how to judge a town's wealth by the quality of its market stalls, and thereby estimate what prices the audience might bear for a performance, how to read the mood of a crowd and adjust the repertoire accordingly, how to maintain dignity while accepting charity, how to leave a place before that place became tired of you. More importantly, he taught Thomas the unspoken rules that governed the world of traveling performers, the circuits that different minstrels worked, the patrons who were generous and those who were capricious, the dangers that lurked in certain villages, the monasteries where a performer might find food and shelter in exchange for prayer and song. The first season was harder than Thomas had anticipated. His fingers, which had been toughened by years of practice, blistered and bled when he played for longer hours than he had in his apprenticeship. His voice grew hoarse. He experienced hunger, not the chronic kind that some faced, but the acute kind that came from miscalculating how far his coin would stretch between towns. He learned that not every crowd appreciated music, that some people regarded performers with suspicion or contempt, that a single bad performance in a small village could be followed by months of remembrance and poor receptions. But he also experienced something that William's warnings had not fully prepared him for. The particular joy that came from seeing a listener's face change during a performance, from watching someone distant become present, from knowing that he had created that shift through the exercise of his own skill and will. He discovered that he had a gift for reading audiences, something beyond technical competence or theoretical knowledge, an intuitive sense of what a particular group needed to hear, whether that was the melancholy of loss, the celebration of survival, or the pure escape of fantasy. By the end of his first season, he had traveled roughly 200 miles in a circuit that took him through market towns and monastery villages across the Midlands. He had earned enough to survive, and enough to know that survival through music was possible, though not guaranteed. He had also begun to understand something about William's cryptic statement, made so many years earlier. The next one to teach you will come when you're ready. That next teacher had turned out to be experience itself, the slow, painful accumulation of knowledge that came from attempting something difficult repeatedly, until the difficulty began to transform into something approaching mastery. In the autumn of his 18th year, Thomas parted with Robert, not acrimoniously, but simply because both had learned what they needed to learn from each other, and the road called in different directions. Robert headed north toward Scotland. Thomas remained in the southern and central routes, establishing himself gradually as a fixture in certain towns, a familiar enough face that innkeepers began to rely on him, that local nobility recognized his name and might request him for celebrations, that a rough reputation began to precede him. He was no longer the merchant's son imagining escape. He was not yet the man he would become, cautious and observant, skilled at survival, guarded in his intimacy, hiding his capacity for gentleness beneath a surface of dry humor. But the seeds of that man were already visible, growing in the specific soil of necessity and choice, on the roads of medieval England, where the past pressed heavily against the present, and the future remained uncertain as weather. The years between 18 and 28 accumulate like sediment, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day a person looks down and realizes they are standing on solid ground that was once liquid. For Thomas, this decade took the shape of a circuit, a particular loop of towns and estates that he traversed with the regularity of a monk following the liturgical calendar. Ashford itself was notably absent from this circuit. He returned once in his 22nd year to discover that his mother had remarried, a widower of modest means who ran a small tavern. She welcomes Thomas warmly but without sentimentality. "You made the right choice," she said, watching him perform at a local gathering. "You would have suffocated here." Whether this was maternal encouragement or maternal relief, Thomas could not determine, and he did not ask. The circuit established itself almost without Thomas's conscious planning. It began with the towns where he had first performed, market centers within a day's hard walking of one another, places where he had demonstrated competence enough to be remembered, places where innkeepers and minor nobility began to anticipate his arrival and allocate space for his performances. As his reputation grew, so did the radius of his travel. He ventured farther south into Hampshire and Sussex, eastward into the edges of Essex, northward as far as Nottinghamshire. But the heart of his circuit remained the cluster of market towns in the Midlands, places like Coventry and Warwick, Tamworth and Lichfield, where he knew the rhythms of market days, where he understood which seasons brought wealthy merchants traveling between fairs, where he had learned to read the particular character and prejudices of the local nobility. The work itself followed patterns that became almost architectural in their predictability. A market fair would draw crowds, and Thomas would position himself in a location where sound carried well, near a church wall, or in the widened space before an important building. He would play music from late morning until his fingers cramped, taking breaks to accept coins from listeners, to eat if someone offered him food, to move his limbs so that stiffness did not settle into his joints. The coins themselves represented a mathematics he had learned to calculate precisely. The cost of lodging varied by season and by town. Bread cost roughly the same everywhere. Ale was cheaper than food, but dehydrating on long roads. The cost of traveling between towns, primarily the wear on shoes, was a constant drain on capital. By his mid-20s, Thomas had developed a mental ledger that would have pleased his merchant father. He knew that performing in a wealthy town on market day might net him a week's worth of reliable food and shelter. He knew that performing for a minor noble's feast day was often more lucrative but less predictable. The payment depended on the noble's mood and the perceived quality of the performance. He knew which villages relied on passing entertainment, and which had enough internal resources to produce their own. He knew which roads were dangerous during certain seasons, and which remained passable year-round. He knew which monasteries welcomed traveling performers, and which regarded them with suspicion. He knew the price of a new pair of shoes, the cost of lute-string replacement, the precise moment in winter when cheap lodging became scarce and expensive. This knowledge was not recorded anywhere except in his memory and in the weathered leather journal that he began keeping in his 24th year. Not a formal record in the manner of clerks and merchants, but a series of brief notes about towns, routes, likely earning periods, and particular patrons worth remembering. The journal became something of a talisman, not so much for its practical information as for what it represented. The idea that a minstrel's life could be calculated and managed, that survival was not merely a matter of luck, but also of accumulated wisdom. What Thomas did not record in his journal, though it operated upon him with as much force as any practical consideration, was the texture of solitude. A minstrel's work was inherently social. He spent his days in crowds, performing for audiences, negotiating with innkeepers and patrons, moving through the commerce of human connection. But solitude operated within this sociability like a stone at the bottom of a well. Between performances, on roads between towns, in the small hours of morning before he began his day's work, Thomas inhabited an interior landscape that few people ever glimpsed. This solitude was not unhappiness exactly. It was the necessary counterpart to his social competence, the private ground upon which his performed confidence was built. He had learned early that people preferred a minstrel who seemed not to require their friendship, who was entertaining and polished, but ultimately separate. This separation protected both parties. The audience could enjoy the performance without the burden of genuine intimacy, and Thomas could perform without the exhaustion of authentic connection. It was a transaction, and like all transactions, it was more satisfying when both parties understood the terms. Still, there were moments when the solitude pressed against him more heavily than others. Winter was the hardest season. The roads became treacherous, and the distance between towns felt infinite. Indoor performances were more common in winter, but they paid less reliably, and often required him to stay in a single location for weeks at a time, long enough for the initial novelty of his presence to fade, for the innkeeper or household to tire of his company, for the subtle social friction to accumulate, until departure became the obvious solution for everyone involved. In his 26th year, during a particularly difficult winter in Coventry, Thomas met Margaret. She was the proprietor of a small tavern that Thomas had passed through occasionally, but had never made a regular circuit. The tavern itself was unremarkable, a timber frame building that listed slightly to one side, with thick smoke that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than the hearth. Margaret was a woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 40 and 50, widowed and childless, running the business with the mixture of competence and resignation that characterized people who have learned not to expect more from life than daily survival. Their connection was not romantic. Thomas had had encounters that might be described as romantic, brief and passionate connections that satisfied something in him, but left him unchanged in any fundamental way. Rather, his connection with Margaret was founded on the recognition that both of them occupied a particular social position, neither fully accepted by the respectable world, nor truly marginal, existing in a kind of permanent negotiation with respectability. A merchant's daughter who had married poorly and found herself widowed young, Margaret had neither the resources to retire to genteel poverty, nor the circumstances to remarry advantageously. The tavern was her compromise with fate, her way of maintaining a precarious independence. What drew Thomas to Margaret's tavern, and what kept him returning each winter thereafter, was her fundamental lack of judgment. She did not regard his work as inferior or unstable. She did not suggest that he should have pursued a more reliable trade. She did not make assumptions about his character based on his profession. She simply accepted that he was a person doing what he had chosen to do, and she offered him reliable lodging at a price he could afford, food that was honestly prepared, and most valuably, conversation that did not demand performance. "You're thinking too much," she said to him once, during a particularly quiet evening when he had been sitting by her fire, nursing a cup of heated wine and staring into the flames. "I can see it in your face. Your audience doesn't pay you to think. They pay you to distract them from their own thinking." "Perhaps I should give them less distraction and more truth," Thomas said. "Truth? You think people want truth? They want the feeling that truth is possible, that their lives make sense, that suffering has meaning. You give them that feeling through music. That's honest enough." It was Margaret who first articulated for Thomas something that he had suspected but never quite named: that the minstrel's function in medieval society was not merely to entertain, but to provide a kind of social lubricant, a way of acknowledging the arbitrary nature of the hierarchy that governed people's lives, without actually threatening that hierarchy. "The Lord hires you to sing about battles and loves and magic," Margaret explained, "because while you're singing, he doesn't have to think about the injustice of his own position. He can feel noble and generous for appreciating art. And meanwhile, the peasants listening get to imagine that their lives have the kind of narrative significance that the songs describe. Everyone walks away feeling that the world makes more sense than it actually does." "That sounds cynical," Thomas said. "Yes," Margaret agreed, "and it's true. The trick is to be cynical without being bitter about it. You understand that the system is corrupt and arbitrary? Good. Now accept that your survival depends on functioning within that system. Use that understanding to navigate the system more skillfully. But don't waste energy hoping the system will change. That way lies madness." This philosophy, pragmatic acceptance combined with clear-eyed assessment of injustice, became something like a North Star for Thomas during these years. It allowed him to observe the world without the paralysis that would have come from either naive idealism or complete despair. He saw peasants working the land that belonged to nobles, and he understood that this arrangement was unjust. He saw minor infractions punished with brutal severity, while major crimes by powerful people went unchecked. He saw talent wasted and mediocrity rewarded. He saw women confined by circumstance and men destroyed by pride. But he also saw that he was not positioned to change any of this, and that the attempt to do so would likely result in his own destruction. This is not to say that he became entirely hardened to injustice. Rather, he developed a kind of internal compartmentalization. The part of him that was a skilled performer, a merchant of distraction and emotion, operated according to the rules of the world as it actually was. But there remained another part of him, smaller, quieter, almost hidden from his own consciousness, that registered injustice, that stored it away, that kept account of the gap between the world as it was and the world as it might be. One particular incident from his 27th year remained with him, the way certain experiences do, acquiring weight and significance only through repetition in memory. He was performing at a market fair in a small town south of Warwick when he witnessed a man being beaten by the town's constable. The man's offense was trivial. He had apparently made a theft of bread from a baker's stall. The beating itself was not unusual. What struck Thomas was not the violence, but the casualness of it. The way the crowd continued about their business. The way no one intervened or even seemed to particularly notice. The baker stood nearby, watching with an expression that suggested neither satisfaction nor regret, simply noting that the system of property rights had been enforced. Later, Thomas performed his usual set of entertaining songs, familiar melodies designed to lift spirits and encourage spending. But he found himself, in a moment of what he later recognized as recklessness, including a song about an unjust judgment, a piece that he rarely performed because it made audiences uncomfortable. He had learned the song from an older minstrel years earlier, had practiced it in private, but recognized instinctively that public performance of such material was dangerous. The song did not directly critique the system. Rather, it told the story of a man falsely accused and, through an almost miraculous intervention, vindicated. The crowd's reaction was muted. Some listened with appreciation for the song's artistry. Others shifted uncomfortably. A few left. Afterward, One of the town officials approached him, a man of middling rank whose title suggested some administrative function. "That song is dangerous," the man said, not threateningly but conversationally. "You should take care not to perform it in places where people are inclined to take its message seriously." "I was simply performing a song," Thomas said carefully. "I meant no offense." "Of course not, and I mean no threat, but you're clever enough to understand the position you're in. You're liked well enough here. People enjoy your performances, but that goodwill is contingent. It depends on your remaining safely outside the genuine conflicts that govern our lives. Perform your beautiful songs, make your living, accept the world as it is. That's the bargain. Perform songs that suggest the world could be different, and you're asking questions that no one who has power wants asked." Thomas had nodded, accepted this warning with the grace that a person of his station extended to people of higher rank, and never performed that song in a populated venue again. He discussed the incident with Margaret only much later, years after it had occurred. "You learned an important lesson," she said. "The world will tolerate your existence only as long as you don't threaten its basic assumptions. A minstrel is allowed to be strange, to live outside normal society, to make unconventional choices. Because his strangeness is contained, it doesn't threaten anything. But the moment you start suggesting that injustice is actually unjust, that poverty might be the result of exploitation rather than divine will, that hierarchy might be arbitrary rather than natural, at that moment, you become dangerous. And dangerous people don't get to survive in comfortable ways." By his late 20s, Thomas had accumulated enough success that he could be selective about work. He turned down performances that seemed unprofitable. He chose between competing offers based on personal preference as much as on income. He had acquired a reputation as a skilled performer and as a person of integrity, which, paradoxically, meant that people trusted him to perform in a way that would not upset the basic order of things. He was hired by nobles and clergy precisely because he was known to be careful, to understand the implicit boundaries of what he should and should not say, to be entertaining without being transgressive. He had also begun in these years to accumulate a kind of internal archive, not consciously maintained, but operative nonetheless. He noticed details about the places he visited, the layout of towns, the relationships between different power holders, the particular strengths and vulnerabilities of local hierarchies. He learned to read people quickly, to understand their anxieties and desires, to recognize patterns in how power operated. Most of this knowledge served his immediate practical purposes. It helped him navigate situations safely, predict how people would respond to his performances, understand where he was genuinely welcome and where he was merely tolerated. But some of this knowledge was simply accumulated, stored away without any particular use in mind. He knew which nobles were genuinely cruel and which merely maintained the appearance of cruelty that their station seemed to require. He knew which priests were actually pious and which were simply performing their own version of authorized drama. He knew which servants were loyal and which were resentful, which were planning escapes, and which had accepted their circumstances as final. He knew which households were rotten at their foundations with hidden conflicts, and which maintained a genuine cohesion despite their hierarchical structure. This knowledge would come to matter more than he could have anticipated, but in his late 20s, It was simply part of the texture of his awareness, one element among many in the rich complexity of how he navigated the world. His final significant relationship from this period was with a woman named Eleanor, the daughter of a merchant in Warwick. Thomas met her at a market fair where he was performing, and she approached him afterward with a directness that was remarkable for a woman of her station. She was educated, having been taught Latin by a tutor her father had hired, and she was restless in her position, constrained by the expectations that governed young women of respectable but not exceptional rank. For several months, they maintained a connection that began as intellectual and gradually became intimate. It was the closest Thomas came during this period to something that might be called genuine love. Eleanor wanted Thomas to settle. She believed that he had demonstrated enough success to establish himself in a single location, perhaps acquiring some property or establishing a more permanent arrangement with a particular household. She could imagine a life where he performed regularly, but without the constant travel, where he had security and community, where they might marry and form a life together. Thomas recognized that what Eleanor was offering was genuinely attractive, and he also recognized that it was impossible. Not because he did not care for her, he did, in a way that surprised him with its depth, but because settling would have transformed him into something he was not. The travel was not merely a practical necessity. It had become something close to a necessity of his soul. The freedom to move, to be anonymous in one town and recognized in the next, to maintain distance, even as he performed connection. These things had become so integral to who he was that the prospect of abandoning them produced a kind of panic. When he tried to explain this to Eleanor, she cried, not from immediate disappointment, but from the realization that he had made a choice between her and something else, something that she could not compete with or even fully understand. "You're afraid of being known," she said, perhaps with some accuracy. "You're afraid that if someone actually knew you, they wouldn't like what they found." He did not argue with her because he suspected she was right. The distance he maintained from people, which he had theorized as pragmatic and wise, might have been something closer to cowardice. But understanding one's cowardice did not necessarily make it possible to overcome it. After Eleanor, Thomas was more careful about romantic entanglements. He had occasional encounters with women, some transactional, some more genuine. But he did not allow himself to develop the kind of connection that might demand he become something different than what he was. He developed a particular loneliness that was almost companionable, a solitude that had acquired texture and depth through years of habituation. By his 28th year, Thomas had settled into a pattern that seemed stable enough to constitute a life. He had money saved, not a great deal, but enough to survive lean seasons. He had a reputation that preceded him. He had places where he was genuinely welcome. He had developed relationships with Margaret, with various innkeepers and minor nobility who hired him regularly, with a loose network of other minstrels who shared information about routes and patrons. He had learned the skills necessary to survive on the road, how to manage his health, how to read dangers, how to maintain the equipment that was essential to his livelihood, how to present himself in ways that opened doors rather than closing them. And yet something in him remained unresolved, unformed. He had spent a decade learning to navigate the world successfully, but the navigation had gradually revealed to him the profound strangeness of the world itself, its injustices, its arbitrary hierarchies, its strange compact between those with power and those without, whereby the powerless accepted their condition in exchange for certain small allowances of dignity. He had learned to perform within this system expertly, but the expertise had not resolved the fundamental questions that had originally drawn him to performance. What was the purpose of telling stories? What was the function of music in a world that seemed fundamentally unjust? Why should he spend his life helping people forget their suffering, when perhaps they should be attending to it more carefully? These questions remained unanswered, suspended in a kind of philosophical uncertainty that was neither comfortable nor quite painful enough to demand resolution. He was accomplished enough to be secure, but not so secure that he could stop thinking about what might be at stake in his choices. He had learned to live skillfully within the world as it was, but he had not stopped wondering what the world might be if it were different. And though he did not yet know it, these unresolved tensions would be the precondition for the events that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to be a witness, to hold knowledge, and to make choices in a world where the consequences of those choices extended far beyond one's own life. The estate of Lord Edmund Fairfax occupied a position of significance without being grand. The house itself was stone-built and substantial, surrounded by gardens and paddocks, situated on a rise that allowed it to survey the surrounding villages without appearing ostentatious. It was the kind of property that suggested wealth and power, but not the kind that suggested either ancient lineage or exceptional influence. Lord Fairfax himself was a man in his middle years, pragmatic and careful, the sort of nobleman who understood that true security came from avoiding unnecessary attention from more powerful people, rather than from spectacular displays of status. Thomas had performed at the estate once before, 3 years prior, at a modest celebration marking the completion of a new wing of the house. The performance had been well received. The payment had been fair, and the household staff had treated him with basic courtesy. It was not an exceptional experience, but it was favorable enough that when Thomas received word through the network of innkeepers and merchants who carried such information that Lord Fairfax was hosting a gathering and had requested the services of the minstrel known for his discretion and skill, he had accepted without hesitation. The gathering was scheduled for late spring, at a time when roads were passable and the weather was mild enough that servants could be stationed outdoors to accommodate the expected number of guests. Thomas arrived 2 days before the event was scheduled to begin, following the practice of more prestigious performers who required time to understand the acoustics of the space where they would be performing, and to establish preliminary relationships with the household staff who might offer information about the anticipated mood of the gathering. The house itself was in a state of organized chaos. Servants moving purposefully through corridors, cooks calculating food quantities, the steward reviewing arrangements with the precision of someone managing the logistics of a small military campaign. Thomas was shown to a small chamber on the 3rd floor, above the main gathering spaces, where he deposited his belongings and tuned his lute in the afternoon light that filtered through a narrow window. It was on the evening of his arrival that he encountered Catherine. She appeared in the corridor as he was making his way toward the servants' hall, where he had been invited to take supper. She was young, clearly not yet 20, possibly not yet 18, dressed in a gown that suggested her position as a member of the household rather than as a guest, though her bearing suggested something more refined than simple servant status. She was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to register everything around her with an intensity that was unusual in a person of her apparent age and position. "You're the minstrel," she said, as though this were a deduction she had made through careful observation rather than a greeting based on prior knowledge. "I am," Thomas confirmed. "And you're Catherine. I'm Lord Fairfax's ward. You'll be performing tomorrow for the gathering, won't you?" "Tomorrow evening, yes, if the arrangements proceed as planned." She studied him with an intensity that was neither hostile nor friendly, simply observant.
"Do you ever perform songs that are true, or only the pleasant ones that lords prefer?" It was a dangerous question, the kind that might trap him into either pretended naivete or genuine honesty, neither of which was particularly wise to offer to an unknown person of uncertain status in a stranger's house. "I perform songs that are well-crafted," he said carefully. "Whether they're true depends on what one means by truth." "I think you know what I mean," she said. "I think you know the difference between songs that describe the world as it is and songs that describe the world as people wish it were." "I do," Thomas acknowledged. "But wisdom in my profession consists largely of knowing when to perform which kind." She smiled slightly at this. "That's honest, at least. Better than most people manage." She turned to leave, then paused. "The gathering tomorrow. Everyone will want you to make them feel better about themselves, about their place in the world."
That's what you're being paid for, isn't it? Among other things, yes. Make sure you include at least one song that doesn't do that. Just one. For the rest of us who are paying attention. Before Thomas could respond, she continued down the corridor and disappeared around a corner, leaving him uncertain whether the conversation had been genuine or whether it had been some kind of test of his character or his wit. The gathering itself was unremarkable by the standards of the minor nobility. Perhaps 30 people attended, local landholders of various ranks, a visiting merchant or two, several clergy, a handful of women whose exact relationship to the host was unclear. The event itself was organized around the formal consumption of an elaborate meal, followed by entertainment and conversation. Thomas performed for perhaps 3 hours, beginning with songs designed to accompany the initial courses of dinner, then shifting toward more substantial musical pieces once the meal had concluded, and attention could be more fully focused on performance. He was competent, as he always was. He read the mood of the gathering and adjusted his material accordingly, sensing when the audience wanted to be moved toward melancholy and when they needed to be drawn back toward levity. He told stories in song form, performed several pieces that demonstrated technical skill with the lute, and generally fulfilled the function that wealthy people hired minstrels to fulfill: the temporary transformation of an ordinary social gathering into something that seemed more significant and meaningful than its daily reality. Catherine remained mostly silent throughout the evening, seated between two older women whose relationship to her seemed cordial but not particularly close. She listened carefully to his performances, and at one point, during a particular song about a journey undertaken with uncertain outcome, Thomas caught her watching him with an expression that suggested she was observing not his performance, but something about him that lay beneath the performance. When the evening concluded and he was thanked by Lord Fairfax and provided with payment, Catherine approached him briefly. "You did include one," she said. "The song about the journey. That one was true, wasn't it? Or at least it contained something true." "It contained a question," Thomas said. "Whether the answer to that question is true depends on how you interpret it." "You're very careful with your words," she said. "I wonder if that's wisdom or if it's fear."
Before Thomas could formulate a response, she had moved away, and he found himself wondering whether the conversation had actually occurred or whether he had imagined it. So strange and direct had been the young woman's engagement, so entirely at odds with the careful social distance that typically governed interaction between performers and their audience. He remained at the estate for one additional day, having been offered employment to participate in some of the secondary entertainment surrounding the gathering. It was during this second day that he encountered Catherine again, this time in the library of the house, a modest room lined with books and parchments, the kind of space that suggested Lord Fairfax had some pretension toward learning, without having actually devoted much personal attention to scholarship. Catherine was reading, seated by a window that provided both light and an apparent view of the gardens. "Do you read?" she asked, not looking up from her book. "Some," Thomas said. "Enough Latin to follow religious texts, some French and English, though less formally. The practical literacy of someone who didn't receive formal training, but learned through necessity." "Better than most," she said. She turned a page deliberately. "I read everything I can find. Father Oswald, he's the priest attached to the church nearby. He brings me books. My uncle disapproves, but he allows it because he doesn't want to seem ungracious toward the church. Have you read philosophy?" "Not extensively. Some Aristotle, second-hand through sermons and commentary." "Would you like to?" The question was strange enough that Thomas found himself considering it seriously, rather than offering a courteous deflection. "I'm not sure I have the temperament for philosophy. The life I lead doesn't allow for the kind of sustained thinking that philosophical study requires." "I think your life requires more thinking than most," Catherine said. "You're constantly assessing people, situations, the distance between what's said and what's true. That's philosophy, even if you don't call it by that name." After this conversation, Thomas left the estate. He was paid, thanked, and began the journey back toward his usual circuits. As he traveled, he found himself remembering Catherine more frequently than he would have expected. She occupied his thoughts not as a romantic interest. There was no aspect of romantic attraction in his memory of her, but as a kind of question mark, an unexpected complexity in a world that he had learned to navigate through the careful application of simplicity and pragmatism. He told Margaret about the encounter when he returned to Coventry for the summer season. "She sounds dangerous," Margaret said, not unkindly. "Intelligent people can be dangerous, especially when they're restless." "Dangerous how?" "Dangerous to themselves, usually. Dangerous to you only if you allow yourself to become entangled in their difficulties." Margaret paused, considering. "She's a ward, you said? That means she's dependent on her uncle's goodwill, with no family to protect her position. A young woman in that situation, if she's intelligent and restless, is in a precarious position. Those circumstances produce either resignation or rebellion, and rebellion is more likely in someone smart enough to understand what she's resigned to." Thomas thought about this assessment and recognized its wisdom. He filed it away as an observation to be remembered but not acted upon. He had learned the discipline of maintaining social distance, and he applied it firmly in his own case. Catherine was an interesting person, but she was not his responsibility and not his concern. Time passed. The summer advanced toward autumn. Thomas maintained his circuits, performing in the familiar towns and estates, accumulating coin and reputation. In late August, he received an unexpected message through a merchant
who regularly traveled between Coventry and the Fairfax estate. The message, written in a careful hand on a small piece of parchment, contained only a few lines. "If you pass near the estate again, come. I want to know if you've been thinking about what I said. Also, I may need someone to talk to who isn't family or clergy. C.F." Thomas considered this message for several days before making a decision. His usual circuits would not take him near the estate for several months. To alter his route and visit would constitute a deliberate choice to engage with Catherine, to acknowledge the connection that had been established between them, to step outside the careful boundaries that governed his interactions with people of higher station. He decided against visiting. He reasoned that to do so would be unwise, that he was likely to be misunderstood, that nothing good could come of further entanglement with a person whose exact social position was ambiguous, and whose situation, as Margaret had correctly identified, was precarious. He attempted to put the matter from his mind, but in late autumn, as he was traveling between market towns, a combination of circumstance and perhaps something closer to fate determined otherwise. He encountered a traveling companion, a merchant heading toward the direction of the Fairfax estate, and the merchant remarked that he was carrying correspondence for Lord Fairfax's household and would be passing by the estate within a few days. The merchant, recognizing Thomas from previous travel, offered to deliver a message if Thomas wished to send one. Thomas found himself agreeing to this, and he wrote a brief note to Catherine, acknowledging her message and indicating that he would pass near the estate in early winter and might visit if circumstances permitted. He told himself this was simply a courteous response, a way of acknowledging her communication without committing himself to anything. He told himself he was maintaining social propriety, and he told himself that whether he actually visited would depend on the contingencies of his travel schedule and the availability of work. What he did not tell himself, but what he knew to be true, was that he was already beginning to move toward the meeting. His careful defenses were beginning to show signs of breaching. The young woman's questions and her directness had unsettled him in a way that suggested his usual mechanisms for maintaining distance were less reliable than he had believed them to be. In early December, traveling in the vicinity of the estate, Thomas made a deliberate detour. He arrived in the late afternoon, presented himself at the gate, and requested that his presence be announced to Catherine if she was available to receive a visitor. He was admitted to the house with a courtesy that suggested his reputation had improved since his last visit, or that Catherine had instructed the household staff to treat him with particular respect. She met him in the library again, as though their previous conversation there had never truly concluded but had only paused. "You came," she said simply. "Your message suggested it would be welcome." "It was. Is. I'm not sure I believed you would actually respond." She gestured to the seat opposite her. "My situation has become more complicated since we last spoke. I wanted to talk to someone who isn't invested in my situation, who doesn't have a stake in advising me to accept things as they are." "I'm not sure I'm the best person for such a conversation," Thomas said carefully. "I have very limited ability to actually help you with anything substantive." "I'm not looking for help," Catherine said. "I'm looking for a witness, someone to listen and acknowledge that what's happening to me is real. That's a particular kind of help, and it's the only kind I can accept from someone who isn't family or clergy." Over the course of that afternoon and evening, Catherine revealed to Thomas the contours of her predicament.
She was the orphaned daughter of a minor nobleman who had been taken in by her uncle, Lord Fairfax, after her father's death when she was 12. She had been raised in the household, treated with adequate courtesy, educated better than most women of her station, because Lord Fairfax valued learning as a marker of status.
But she had gradually come to understand that her position was fundamentally contingent. She existed in her uncle's house because it was convenient to do so, but she had no claim on the household, no genuine security, and no real control over her own future. "He's negotiating a marriage for me," she said, "to a man I've never met, a landholder perhaps 30 miles south. The man is considerably older, a widower with several children. The arrangement appears designed to secure an alliance between our uncle and this man's family, which is rising in prosperity and influence. I am the commodity through which this alliance is purchased." "This is not unusual," Thomas said, and immediately regretted the inadequacy of the statement. "No," Catherine agreed, "it's entirely ordinary. That's part of what makes it so unbearable. If it were unique, I might have some grounds for resistance. But it's so completely normal that no one seems to notice my actual opinion about it. My uncle believes he's being generous. He's arranging a respectable match, which is more than many girls in my position receive. The intended husband is apparently a decent sort, not a brute, reasonably well positioned. I should be grateful. The marriage will probably be as comfortable as these arrangements typically are. I should accept it as my duty." "But you don't wish to accept it?" "I wish to not be a commodity," Catherine said flatly. "I wish to have some say in the direction of my own life. I wish to be something other than a strategic asset. But those wishes appear to be incompatible with my actual circumstances." Thomas listened to her as she elaborated on the situation, and he found himself in a position that was both ordinary for his profession — people often used minstrels as confessor figures — and disturbing in its specificity. He was not merely listening to abstract grievances. He was being asked to witness and validate a particular person's suffering and sense of injustice in a situation where he had no power to change anything. "I don't know what advice to offer you," he said finally. "I can listen, and I can acknowledge that your situation is genuinely difficult. But beyond that, I'm not asking for advice," Catherine interrupted. "I'm asking you to listen and to remember. If something happens to me, I want someone outside the family and outside the church to know who I was before it happened. To know that I didn't simply accept this passively, that I understood what was being done to me, that I objected to it. I want that testimony to exist somewhere outside myself." Thomas found himself agreeing to this, sensing both its importance and its strangeness. He promised Catherine that he would carry the memory of this conversation, that he would think of her as his own person, and not merely as a strategic asset. He promised to listen to whatever else she might wish to tell him, within the bounds of his available time and opportunity. As the evening passed and night deepened, the conversation gradually shifted away from Catherine's predicament toward more general topics. She asked him about his life, about the places he had traveled, about his understanding of the world beyond the relatively narrow sphere that she inhabited. He found himself sharing more about himself than he typically did with people of her station, revealing details and perspectives that he usually kept hidden behind his performed competence. When he departed the following morning, Catherine walked with him to the gate of the estate. "Thank you," she said.
I don't know what difference it will make, but I'm grateful that someone knows."
"I know," Thomas confirmed. "And I'll remember." He left the estate, intending to put the matter from his mind, to return to his circuits and his established patterns, to maintain the careful distance that his profession and his instinct both counseled him to preserve. He did not know that Catherine's situation was far more complicated than she had revealed, that she was carrying secrets that were more significant than the obvious injustice of her situation, that the events set in motion by her existence would eventually reshape his entire understanding of what it meant to be a witness. For the remainder of that winter, Thomas performed his usual work, moved through his established circuits, and maintained the equilibrium that had characterized his adult life. Catherine occupied his thoughts occasionally, the way that meaningful but isolated conversations sometimes do. He remembered her clearly, her intelligence, her directness, her anger at a situation she could not control. But he did not adjust his route to visit her again. He told himself that one visit had been sufficient to honor their connection, that further entanglement would be unwise, that the proper response to her situation was acceptance tempered by sympathy. It was not until the spring that the news reached him, carried by a merchant traveling through Coventry, delivered in the casual manner of someone sharing local gossip. The young woman at the Fairfax estate, Lord Fairfax's ward, Catherine, had disappeared. She had been gone for nearly 3 weeks when the news reached the wider region. The official story, as far as Thomas could determine, was that she had run away to escape her arranged marriage, perhaps eloping with a man of unsuitable rank. Search parties had been sent out, but the trail was cold. She had apparently fled at night, leaving no note and taking with her nothing except the clothes on her back. Thomas received this information with a sensation that he had not anticipated. A sharp, stabbing guilt, combined with a curious helplessness. She had asked him to witness, to remember. He had promised that he would. But what good was a promise that consisted merely of internal testimony? The merchant provided no further details, and Thomas found himself unable to ask for them without drawing attention to a connection that he should not have. He filed the information away, stored it in memory alongside the details of their conversations, and attempted to return to his ordinary work. But something had shifted in him. Some equilibrium had been disrupted. The comfortable distance that he had maintained from the world's injustices had suddenly proved insufficient. He had been asked to bear witness, and he had done so, and yet the witnessing seemed to matter not at all. The consequences of Catherine's disappearance would not become apparent for months. But the seed had been planted. In that moment when a merchant casually mentioned an event that had occurred in a household where Thomas had once performed, where a young woman had once asked him to remember her. The seed would grow slowly, would begin producing questions that Thomas could not easily dismiss, would eventually transform the entire trajectory of his life. For now, however, he simply returned to his work, carrying Catherine's absence with him like a weight that he did not fully understand, that he could not name precisely, but that he could not quite manage to ignore. The priest appeared on a gray afternoon in early summer, in the tavern where Thomas was taking his meal between performances. Father Oswald was a young man, perhaps 5 years younger than Thomas, though his manner suggested both experience and a kind of idealistic uncertainty that came from having encountered reality without yet learning to fully accommodate it. He was dressed in the simple habit of a parish priest attached to a monastery, and he moved with a deliberateness that suggested he had rehearsed this approach multiple times before actually executing it. "You're Thomas," the priest said, not as a question, but as a statement. "The minstrel. I've heard you perform. I wanted to speak with you privately, if you were willing." Thomas gestured to the empty chair at his table, signaling Margaret, who was watching this interaction with sharp attention, to leave them undisturbed. "I'm willing to listen," he said carefully, "though I should note that I'm not accustomed to private conversation with clergy. It tends to draw attention." "I'm aware of that," Father Oswald said. He sat, maintaining the physical proximity that suggested either urgency or an unusual lack of social caution. "I've traced you through several sources, following information from town to town. I needed to speak with you because I believe you may have knowledge relevant to a matter of significant importance." "What matter?" "Catherine Fairfax, the young woman who disappeared from Lord Fairfax's household last spring." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a tightening that he attempted to keep from manifesting in his expression. "I've heard the story, that she ran away to escape an arranged marriage. It's sad, but these things do happen." "She didn't run away," Father Oswald said flatly. "Or rather, if she did run away, it was because she was running from something far more significant than an unwanted marriage. And I believe you know more about her than you've indicated to anyone else." The priest had dropped his voice to barely above a whisper, conscious of the other patrons in the tavern. Thomas found himself assessing this person, evaluating whether he represented genuine knowledge or paranoid suspicion, whether he could be trusted or whether his presence constituted a threat of some kind. "I met Catherine twice," Thomas said, choosing to acknowledge the connection rather than deny it completely. "I performed at the estate, and we had 2 brief conversations. That's the extent of my knowledge of her." "You're lying," Father Oswald said without rancor. "Not completely. You did perform at the estate, and you did have brief conversations. But you also returned to the estate in the winter specifically to see her. You were there for an afternoon and evening, and you spent time speaking with her privately. I have this information from one of the kitchen servants who noticed and remembered." Thomas considered his options. He could continue to deny, but the priest clearly had enough information to know that further denial would be pointless. He could ask how this information had been obtained and what the priest intended to do with it. Or he could attempt to understand what Father Oswald actually wanted. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked. "I want you to help me understand what happened to Catherine. I want you to tell me what she said to you, what her state of mind was, what information she might have shared that could illuminate why she disappeared." "And what makes you believe I know anything beyond what I've indicated?" "Because she asked you to remember her," Father Oswald said. "Because she told you things she didn't tell anyone else. Not her uncle, not the household staff, not even me, though I've been the closest thing to a genuine confidant she had access to. She was strategic about what she revealed to whom, and she chose to reveal something significant to you." I need to understand what that was. It was Thomas's experience that people who claimed to know you actually knew very little about you. They projected assumptions onto you, interpreted your silences in ways that confirmed their existing beliefs, constructed narratives about your character and motivations based on minimal evidence. But Father Oswald seemed to be doing something different. He seemed to actually be paying attention, to be noticing details and drawing conclusions based on observation rather than assumption. I need to understand your intentions first, Thomas said. What do you intend to do with whatever information I provide? Are you investigating on behalf of Lord Fairfax? Are you attempting to locate Catherine? Or is this something else? I'm investigating because I believe Catherine didn't run away, and I believe she's dead, Father Oswald said quietly. I'm investigating because I think something significant happened at the Fairfax estate. Something that the official narrative, her running away, is designed to obscure. And I'm investigating because I'm a priest, and I believe that bears some obligation to speak for people who cannot speak for themselves. The weight of this declaration seemed to settle into the space between them. Thomas was aware, viscerally, that he was being asked to cross a threshold that he had been taught to avoid. He was being invited into something that could constitute a genuine danger to himself, something that exceeded the comfortable distance that his profession typically maintained from the serious conflicts that governed people's lives. "If I speak with you," Thomas said slowly, "I need to understand that I'm doing so in confidence, not in the context of any official investigation, or in ways that could bring me to the attention of people in power." "I can't guarantee that," Father Oswald said. "But I can tell you that my investigation is motivated by genuine concern for truth, not by any desire to harm you or to expose you to unnecessary danger." Thomas found himself believing the priest, based on nothing more definitive than an intuitive sense that this young man had not yet learned to dissemble effectively, that his idealism was still intact enough that his words corresponded reasonably closely to his actual motivations. This belief was almost certainly foolish. It was the kind of trust that Margaret had warned him against, but it was powerful enough to override his better judgment. "All right," he said, "but not here, not in the tavern where people know me." They arranged to meet 2 evenings later, at a small monastery some distance from Coventry. Father Oswald had connections to the place, and had arranged for them to have access to a private room where conversation could occur without risk of being overheard. Thomas spent the intervening time in a state of uncertain anxiety, second-guessing his decision, considering whether to simply disappear, to alter his usual circuits, and avoid any further contact with the priest. But he also found himself visiting Margaret, and telling her, in careful terms, that he had encountered someone connected to Catherine's disappearance, and was planning to speak with that person. "You're a fool," Margaret said flatly. "You understand that? You've been carefully maintaining distance from complications, and now you're running directly toward them." "I gave Catherine my word that I would remember her," Thomas said. "I told her that I would be a witness to what she was experiencing." Bearing witness and investigating are different things. One is passive, the other is active. One involves risk, primarily to your internal peace. The other involves risk to your life and freedom. "I know that," Thomas said, "but it seems to me that the witnessing was incomplete." "She asked me to remember if something happened to her. Something did happen. I have a responsibility to at least understand what." Margaret regarded him with a mixture of exasperation and affection. "You've spent years learning to be careful, and you're going to undo all of that because of one conversation with a young woman you barely knew. That's not nobility, Thomas. That's sentiment, dressed in virtue's clothing." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, "but it's what I've decided." He arrived at the monastery in the late afternoon, traveling on minor roads that were less frequented than the main routes. Father Oswald was waiting in a small stone room adjacent to the library, a space that was apparently occasionally used by the monastery's monks for private prayer or meditation. The priest had brought bread, cheese, and ale, the offering of hospitality that suggested he understood the significance of what they were about to do. "Tell me about your conversations with Catherine," Father Oswald said once they had settled. "Everything you remember, even details that seem unimportant." Thomas recounted the first conversation, Catherine asking him whether he ever performed songs that were true, her observation that he seemed to understand the difference between describing the world as it was and as people wished it to be. He described the second conversation in the library, where Catherine had first mentioned her impending marriage and had asked him to be a witness to her suffering and her resistance. Father Oswald listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, building a picture of Catherine's state of mind and her circumstances. "Did she mention anything about her personal situation, beyond the arranged marriage? Did she say anything about her relationship with her uncle, or with members of the household staff?" "She mentioned feeling uncertain about her future," Thomas recalled. "She said her position in the household was contingent, that she had no real security or control. But she spoke about that in general terms, the way she might have spoken about the condition of being a young woman dependent on someone else's goodwill." "Think carefully," Father Oswald said. "Was there anything in her manner that suggested she was hiding something? Some specific anxiety beneath the more general grievance?" Thomas closed his eyes, attempting to reconstruct the tone and content of their conversations with more precision, and as he did so, he became aware of a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time, but that acquired different significance when considered in retrospect. Catherine had asked him to promise that he would remember her, that he would carry testimony to her existence and her consciousness. She had spoken as though her future was not merely uncertain, but potentially dangerous, as though the act of bearing witness might be the last service he could perform for her. "She was afraid," Thomas said finally, "not merely unhappy or frustrated, genuinely afraid. I didn't recognize it at the time because she expressed it through intellectual discussion rather than through emotional confession. But she was afraid." "Afraid of what? Of the marriage itself?" "I don't think so. The marriage seemed like a cause of unhappiness, but not of fear. The fear seemed to be directed at something else, something she couldn't or wouldn't articulate directly." Father Oswald rose and began to pace the small room. "About 6 months before Catherine disappeared, Lord Fairfax made several financial transactions that suggest he was in debt to someone significant. A colleague of mine, a monk who has some connection to the record-keeping that surrounds land transfers, indicated that Fairfax had acquired a substantial loan and had pledged certain properties as collateral. This was kept private, but financial arrangements of that magnitude eventually become known." "What does that have to do with Catherine?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew where this was leading. "I believe Catherine was with child," Father Oswald said bluntly. "I believe the father was not the man she was to be married to, but someone of unsuitable rank. And I believe the arranged marriage was designed to conceal this situation, to allow Catherine to present herself as a virgin bride with a child that could be claimed by her future husband as legitimate." Thomas felt the full weight of this revelation. It transformed Catherine's situation from merely unjust into genuinely dangerous. A woman of high birth carrying a child out of wedlock, particularly a child fathered by someone of low rank, constituted a scandal that could destroy the reputation of her entire family,
could end her uncle's prospects for advantageous alliances, could result in consequences ranging from severe punishment to death. "You believe she was killed?" Thomas asked. "I believe it's possible. I believe she might have run away to escape both the marriage and what she perceived as danger to herself. Or I believe she might have been killed by someone, possibly her uncle, more likely someone acting on behalf of her uncle, to prevent the scandal from becoming public." "But there's no body," Thomas said. "No evidence that she's actually dead." "No public evidence," Father Oswald corrected. "Bodies can be disposed of in ways that prevent discovery."
People can disappear completely if the resources and motivation exist to make that happen. Over the course of the next several hours, Father Oswald elaborated on his investigation. He had been the person closest to Catherine in her final months. She had sought his counsel, and he had offered her what spiritual guidance he could, while simultaneously becoming increasingly concerned about her state of mind. He had gathered information from servants in the household, from other clergy who had connections to the Fairfax family, from merchants who traded gossip along with goods. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but troubling. Catherine had been restless and anxious in the months leading to her disappearance. She had seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict. Several servants had noted that she had visited a woman in the village, a woman known to provide herbal remedies, and whose services were sometimes sought by women attempting to manage situations that could not be managed within the bounds of respectable society. There was evidence that Catherine had been attempting to terminate her pregnancy. "If that's what she was doing," Thomas said slowly, "and if she succeeded, then the danger would have passed," Father Oswald finished. "The marriage would no longer have been necessary. The scandal would have been averted. But by that point, her uncle may have already set other events in motion." "You're suggesting he killed her?" "I'm suggesting it's possible. I'm suggesting that the official narrative, that she ran away, doesn't adequately explain what actually happened. And I'm suggesting that the truth needs to be investigated, which means I need help understanding what Catherine was thinking, who she might have confided in, what her intentions actually were." Thomas found himself once again in a position where he was being asked to participate in something that exceeded the careful boundaries he had constructed around his own existence. But he also found himself unable to refuse. The weight of Catherine's request that he bear witness to her existence had become something more active than mere memory. It had become an obligation to understand what had happened to her, and to the extent that understanding was possible, to act on that understanding. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "I need you to travel to places you normally perform. I need you to be attentive to what you hear, gossip from servants, conversations between merchants, rumors about the Fairfax household. I need you to gather information through your position as someone who moves through different social circles, who is listened to and spoken to freely, because you're considered a kind of neutral observer. I need you to be my second set of ears." "That could take months," Thomas said. "It could," Father Oswald agreed. "But Catherine deserves that. And if I'm right about what happened, then the people responsible should be held accountable." "And if you're wrong?" Thomas asked. "If she actually did run away and is living somewhere in safety, and we're creating a false narrative that will lead to injustice? Then we'll discover that, and the investigation will end. But I don't believe I'm wrong. I believe something significant happened at the Fairfax estate, and I believe that truth matters enough to justify the effort of uncovering it." Thomas agreed to assist Father Oswald in his investigation, though he did so with a sense of crossing a threshold that he understood fully would change the nature of his existence. He was accustomed to observing the world from a carefully maintained distance. He was about to become actively engaged in attempting to understand events whose investigation could bring him into conflict with powerful people. Over the following weeks, Thomas began deliberately altering his travel patterns. He maintained his regular circuits, but adjusted them to include villages and towns closer to the Fairfax estate. He began to listen more carefully to the conversations around him, noticing details about the household, about servants who might have been connected to Catherine, about the financial dealings of Lord Fairfax himself. He established regular communication with Father Oswald through a system of messages left at specific locations: the base of a particular tree near a crossroads, the stone shrine that marked a boundary between parishes. The priest had also begun investigating in his own way, using his connections to the church to gather information about Catherine's activities in her final months. He had identified the woman in the village that Catherine had visited, an older woman named Eleanor, who was not quite a physician and not quite a herbalist, but something between them, someone who women sought out when they needed assistance that the formal structures of society could not or would not provide. When Thomas eventually met with Eleanor, under the pretense of seeking a remedy for a minor ailment, he found her to be remarkably direct about what Catherine had been attempting. She did not confirm specific details. She was cautious, aware that she was vulnerable to serious consequences if her work became too public. But she made clear that Catherine had indeed been pregnant and had sought ways to end that pregnancy. The girl was intelligent, Eleanor said, as she prepared a tisane that Thomas did not actually need. She understood her situation, and she understood what her uncle would do if he discovered the truth. She was attempting to address it before any extreme measures became necessary. "Did she succeed?" Thomas asked quietly. Eleanor did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "Girls in her position have limited options. If they're fortunate, they find ways to manage their circumstances. If they're less fortunate, other people manage their circumstances for them." The ambiguity in this response seemed intentional. Thomas understood that Eleanor was signaling that she did not know with certainty what had happened to Catherine, and that she was unwilling to speculate about the fate of someone who had sought her assistance and been unable to pay her fully because Catherine's access to money had been controlled by her uncle. As the investigation deepened, Thomas became aware of the way that knowledge operated in a feudal society. Information was fragmented, dispersed among different people and communities, visible to those with eyes to see it, but not consolidated into any kind of coherent narrative that could easily be verified or acted upon. No one knew the full story. Servants knew fragments of what they had observed. Clergy had access to confessionals and to conversations conducted in private. Merchants heard gossip from multiple sources. But because no single person possessed comprehensive knowledge, the truth remained elusive and difficult to establish. By late summer, Father Oswald and Thomas had assembled a picture of Catherine's final months that seemed reasonably complete, though it remained frustratingly incomplete in the details that actually mattered. Catherine had been pregnant. She had attempted to end her pregnancy through herbal means. The pregnancy had apparently ended, whether successfully through Eleanor's remedies or through some other mechanism, neither Thomas nor Father Oswald could determine. But something had changed in Catherine's state of mind after that point. The records of her being seen in public became sporadic. Servants reported that she had become withdrawn and anxious, And then, abruptly, she was gone. The official story was that she had fled at night, leaving behind a brief note indicating that she could not face the marriage she had been promised, and was choosing instead to disappear. The note had been revealed to some members of the household staff, but apparently not preserved or examined with particular care. Lord Fairfax had organized search parties, but they had found no trace of her. The conclusion that had been reached was that she had fled with sufficient determination and foresight to completely evade pursuit. "But that doesn't make sense," Father Oswald said, during one of their increasingly frequent private meetings. Catherine was a young woman with limited money and limited knowledge of the world beyond her uncle's estates. She had no family outside the household to flee to. She had no obvious means of supporting herself. Running away would have required resources and connections that she didn't have. "Unless she ran with someone," Thomas suggested. "Someone with money and a reason to help her." "I've considered that possibility, but there's no evidence of such a person. No suspicious relationships have emerged, no rumors of a lover who helped her escape. Or perhaps," Thomas said carefully, "the simplest explanation is the correct one. Perhaps she didn't run away at all. Perhaps she died, either from complications of her own attempt to end her pregnancy or from something else. And perhaps her uncle, concerned about scandal, put forth the story about her running away to conceal what had actually happened." The investigation had reached a point where further progress seemed impossible. The threads that they had traced led nowhere definitive. The evidence they had assembled suggested genuine wrongdoing, but did not constitute proof of anything that could be acted upon. Thomas found himself increasingly frustrated, haunted by the gap between suspicion and knowledge, between understanding that something was deeply wrong and being able to prove it or do anything about it. It was at this point that Richard the steward entered their investigation, though neither Thomas nor Father Oswald had actually planned for him to do so. Richard was Lord Fairfax's most trusted servant, a man in his early 40s who had managed the household and the estate's daily operations with a kind of careful attention that suggested either genuine loyalty or profound self-interest, or likely both. Thomas had encountered him briefly during his performances at the estate, had noted him as the type of person who held significant power despite his technically subordinate position. Father Oswald reported, through one of his monastic connections, that Richard had recently made a substantial purchase, a small cottage and surrounding land several villages south of the Fairfax estate. The acquisition was unusual for a servant, whose typical financial resources would not support such investment. The purchase had apparently been made through an intermediary, with the actual source of funds obscured, but the transaction had eventually made its way into the kind of half-public record that connected pieces of property to their legal owners. "How could a steward afford such a property?" Thomas asked. "That's the question I've been asking myself," Father Oswald said. "The most likely explanation is that someone with significant resources, someone like Lord Fairfax, gave Richard money. And the question then becomes, why? What would motivate Lord Fairfax to reward his steward in such a generous manner? Unless the payment isn't for rewarding loyalty," Thomas said slowly, understanding beginning to form in his mind, "but for securing silence, for ensuring that something Richard knows or did remains hidden." The implications of this began to crystallize. Richard had been present in the household when Catherine disappeared. Richard would have had access to information about her activities, her relationships, her state of mind. Richard, as the person responsible for managing the household's practical operations, would have been the one coordinated response to her disappearance. And Richard, if he had been involved in something directly connected to Catherine's death or disappearance, would have been in a position to require silence, or possibly to have actively participated in ensuring that silence, through whatever means he deemed necessary. The investigation had reached a threshold where Thomas understood that he had moved beyond the role of careful observer into something closer to active participant in uncovering a genuine crime. He was afraid, genuinely afraid, in a way that he had not been afraid before. Fear of the kind of danger that could result from knowing too much about the activities of powerful people. Fear that his investigation could bring attention to himself that he did not wish to attract. Fear that his existence, carefully constructed to maintain distance from serious conflict, was beginning to dissolve. But he also found himself unable to retreat from what he had begun. Catherine's voice, remembered from their conversations, seemed to demand that he continue. And his own sense of integrity, his understanding that he had made a promise that went deeper than merely having a memory, compelled him forward despite the mounting danger he sensed was approaching. The investigation advanced through the slow accumulation of detail rather than through any dramatic revelation. Father Oswald and Thomas, working through separate channels, began to construct a more precise understanding of the circumstances surrounding Catherine's disappearance. The picture that emerged was not a single definitive narrative, but rather a constellation of smaller truths that pointed toward a larger and darker reality. Through conversations with monks who had connections to the Fairfax household clergy, Father Oswald learned that Lord Fairfax had entered into a significant financial arrangement with a nobleman of greater influence, a man named Aldwyn, whose lands adjoined Fairfax's property to the south, and who had been systematically acquiring influence through strategic marriages and alliances. The arrangement appeared to involve a debt of substantial magnitude, secured through a combination of land pledges and a marriage alliance. Catherine was the linchpin of that alliance. Her marriage to Aldwyn's widowed son would have cemented a connection between the two families and secured Fairfax's access to credit and protection that he apparently desperately needed. The financial pressure on Fairfax was severe, Father Oswald explained during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. He had overextended himself through various ventures, land improvements, building projects, military obligations to his liege. He had become dependent on the goodwill of more powerful people. The arrangement with Aldwyn was not merely a matter of honor or dynastic advancement. It was a matter of survival. If Fairfax's financial position had collapsed, he would have lost everything. And Catherine's pregnancy threatened that arrangement, Thomas said, understanding the implications. If Aldwyn had discovered that Catherine was not a virgin, if he had learned that she had conceived a child by a man of unsuitable rank, the alliance would have been broken. Aldwyn would have had grounds to repudiate the betrothal entirely. Fairfax's entire financial arrangement would have collapsed. Father Oswald paused, choosing his words carefully. Which means that Fairfax had a powerful motive to ensure that Catherine's condition remained hidden, and an equally powerful motive to ensure that she did not become a liability. Through Margaret's extensive network of tavern gossip and merchant connections, Thomas gathered information about Richard the steward. Richard had originally come from a village near Aldwin's lands. He was not a man who had risen from poverty, but rather someone of modest merchant background who had been placed in service with the Fairfax household as part of some earlier arrangement. He had family connections to Aldwin's household, which meant that his loyalties might be divided, or alternatively, that he was already a spy for Aldwin's interests embedded within Fairfax's structure. The cottage that Richard had purchased was situated on a road that led toward Aldwin's territory. It was isolated enough to ensure privacy, but connected enough to be accessible. It was, Thomas noted, the kind of property that someone might acquire if they were planning to leave their current position of service and establish some kind of independent existence. Or it was the kind of property that might be given as payment for ensuring someone else's silence about matters that the giver wished to remain hidden. As their investigation deepened, Thomas became increasingly aware that they were treading dangerous ground. The pattern that was beginning to emerge suggested not merely injustice, but actual crime, possibly murder, certainly conspiracy and concealment. These were matters that affected powerful people whose interests would be served by ensuring that investigations ceased and that investigators remained silent. The first warning came in a subtle form. Thomas was performing at a market fair in a town roughly 30 miles from Coventry when he noticed a man, unremarkable in appearance, dressed in the manner of a servant or laborer, positioned in the crowd with too much focus on Thomas's performance. The man did not request songs or offer coin. He simply watched with the fixed attention of someone conducting surveillance, rather than genuinely listening to music. When Thomas concluded his performance and began to move through the market, the man made no attempt to approach him, but maintained a visible presence in his peripheral awareness. Thomas altered his usual path through the town, deliberately moving into crowded areas and busier streets, and eventually lost track of the man. But the incident left him disturbed in a way that went beyond simple apprehension. It suggested that his investigation had been noticed, that his activities had drawn attention from people who had reason to ensure that his investigation did not progress further. He reported the encounter to Father Oswald at their next meeting, a clandestine gathering in a small grove of trees beyond the sightlines of the monastery. It could be coincidence, Father Oswald said, though his tone suggested he did not believe this. It could be someone you offended at a performance. Someone who means you no harm, but whose presence is simply unfortunate timing. It could be, Thomas agreed, but you don't believe that any more than I do. Someone is watching me. Someone is aware that I'm connected to your investigation, or at least that I'm asking questions about Catherine and the Fairfax household. Then we should be more cautious, Father Oswald said. We should reduce the frequency of our meetings. We should ensure that our communication is conducted through more indirect means. Or we should stop, Thomas said quietly. We should accept that we've gathered what we can gather, that we've reached the limits of what can be safely investigated by two people without resources or authority. We should withdraw and accept that some injustices cannot be remedied. Father Oswald looked at Thomas with an expression that suggested disappointment, but also something like understanding. That's what wisdom would counsel, the priest said. That's what Margaret has probably already advised you to do, and you should listen to that counsel. But you're not going to stop, Thomas said. I can't, Father Oswald said simply. I'm a priest. I have access to certain resources that you don't have. I can speak with church authorities. I can invoke ecclesiastical law. I can push for official investigation in ways that you cannot. I have some protection through my position that you lack. So I'll continue, but you should consider whether the risk is proportional to what you can actually accomplish. Thomas found himself in a state of uncomfortable tension. The rational part of him, the part that had been carefully constructed over decades of learning to survive, understood that Father Oswald was offering him an exit from a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. That same rational part recognized that the investigation had likely reached its practical limits, that they had gathered enough to form suspicions, but not enough to establish proof, and that continuing would bring escalating danger without proportional benefit. But another part of him, a part that Catherine's request had awakened, found withdrawal impossible. He had made a promise. He had been asked to bear witness. The witnessing was incomplete. "I'll continue," he said to Father Oswald, "but more carefully. I won't directly ask questions about Catherine or the steward. I'll simply listen, observe, and report what I hear. That way I can maintain my cover as a performer, rather than revealing myself as an investigator." Over the following months, Thomas's investigation continued through a different modality. He stopped actively seeking information and instead became more attentive to the information that came to him through the normal channels of performance and social interaction. He listened to the conversations of merchants and innkeepers. He paid attention to the servants who provided him with food and lodging. He noted patterns in what people said, what they avoided saying, and what they seemed anxious about. It was through this more passive investigation that he began to perceive the broader picture of corruption that connected the Fairfax household to Aldwyn's interests. Financial arrangements that seemed designed to conceal the movement of significant sums of money. Servants who appeared to work for Fairfax, but who seemed to be receiving instructions or payments from other sources. The gradual acquisition of leverage over various household members, people who seemed to be operating under duress, or under an understanding that their cooperation was required. Thomas also became aware of another element that had previously been invisible. The way that such arrangements infected the entire social fabric. Once he began to perceive the corruption centered on the Fairfax household, he began to notice similar patterns elsewhere. Nobles whose loyalties seemed to be purchased rather than earned. Servants who appeared to operate under some external direction. Transactions that seemed designed to conceal rather than to clarify. The medieval world that he had always understood as fundamentally hierarchical and unjust began to appear even more disturbing. Not merely unjust, but corrupt, operating through hidden mechanisms that most people were either not aware of or chose not to notice. Margaret warned him with increasing insistence to disengage from this awareness. "You're seeing too much," she said to him one evening as he sat exhausted in her tavern. "You're beginning to understand the mechanisms through which power actually operates. And that understanding is dangerous. Not because anyone will punish you for it, but because it will poison the way you experience the world. You'll stop being able to perform your functions. You'll become bitter and useless." "Perhaps bitter and useless is what I should become," Thomas said wearily. "Perhaps accommodating myself to injustice is what has been poisonous, and what I'm experiencing now is health rather than sickness." "That's naive," Margaret said flatly. "Bitter people don't change the world. They just suffer more than they did when they accepted it. You have a choice. You can see what you're seeing, acknowledge it, and then choose to continue functioning within the system, accepting that you cannot change it. Or you can allow the awareness to destroy you. Those are the only real options. Revolution and radical change are not options, not for people in your position, not in the world as it actually is. Thomas understood that Margaret was right, and he also understood that her rightness did not change the fact that he could not unknow what he had learned, could not unsee what he had begun to perceive. He was caught in a state of moral clarity that offered no clear course of action, awareness that seemed to demand something he could not actually provide. It was around this time that the second warning came. This time it was not subtle. Thomas was traveling on a minor road between market towns when he was deliberately intercepted by two men on horseback, rough-looking men whose bearing suggested they were accustomed to violence. They did not attempt to rob him or physically harm him. Instead, they delivered a message with the precision of people following explicit instructions. "You should stop asking questions," the larger of the two men said. His accent suggested he came from a region some distance away, perhaps working as a mercenary or hired hand. "You should stop traveling to places where people remember you and might talk to you about things that are not your concern. You should, in fact, consider leaving this region entirely and seeking your fortune elsewhere." "And if I don't?" Thomas asked, maintaining a calm he did not entirely feel. "Then the next warning will be less polite. And the warning after that won't be a warning at all." The men departed without further conversation, riding away in the direction they had come. Thomas sat for some time on the side of the road, allowing his hands to stop shaking, attempting to process what had just occurred. The warning was unambiguous. Someone with resources was monitoring his activities, had decided that his investigation had progressed too far, and was offering him an opportunity to withdraw before more serious consequences were enacted. He reported the incident to Father Oswald immediately, traveling to the monastery under the pretense of seeking spiritual counsel. "This is serious," the priest said, his young face aged by concern. "This is a direct threat. You should probably leave. Not just the region, this entire kingdom possibly. Travel to France, or farther. Establish yourself somewhere where the Fairfax family's reach cannot touch you." "What about the investigation?" Thomas asked. "What about Catherine?" "What about her?" Father Oswald responded, his voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, we've done what we can. We have suspicions. We have evidence of wrongdoing, of corruption, of conspiracy. But we don't have proof of actual crime. We don't have witnesses who are willing to testify publicly. We don't have anything that would convince church authorities or secular justice to act. Catherine is already dead. Our investigation cannot change that. What we can change is your fate, if you choose to do so now, before the warnings escalate into actual violence." "So we simply stop," Thomas said bitterly. "We simply accept that evil men will continue to operate without consequence, that Catherine's death will go unacknowledged, that the truth will be buried along with her body." "Yes," Father Oswald said, "that's what we do. That's what people in our positions have always done, what they will continue to do. Because the alternative is our own destruction, and destroyed people cannot help anyone. I've wrestled with this, Thomas. I've prayed about it and discussed it with monks far wiser than myself. The conclusion I've reached is that bearing witness, even if that witness cannot immediately produce justice,
is the responsibility that remains to us. We know the truth. We will carry the truth. We will speak it when opportunities present themselves, to people we trust. But we will not sacrifice ourselves trying to enforce it upon people who have more power than we do. Thomas spent the following days in a state of turmoil, caught between the impulse toward self-preservation and the sense that withdrawing at this point would constitute a betrayal of Catherine, of Father Oswald, and of his own integrity. He considered Margaret's counsel, which had been consistent: leave, disappear, establish yourself in a new location, resume your life with different parameters. He considered Father Oswald's warning, which was essentially an appeal to practical wisdom and self-interest. But he also considered Catherine's voice, remembered from their conversations, and the promise he had made her: to remember, to bear witness, to acknowledge her existence as a person rather than as a strategic asset or an obstacle to be removed. He came to a decision that was neither the counsel of wisdom nor the demand of complete integrity, but something between them. He would not flee entirely, but he would alter the nature of his presence. He would withdraw from direct investigation, would stop asking explicit questions, but he would continue to move through the region, would continue to perform, would maintain his networks of observation and information gathering. And most importantly, he would find a way to transform what he knew into something public, something that could not be easily suppressed or contained. The form that this transformation would take began to take shape in his mind during the weeks following the warning. He could not accuse. He could not testify. He could not demand justice. But he could tell stories. He could compose songs that carried truth encoded in metaphor and emotion, songs that could be performed publicly without appearing to directly threaten anyone, songs that would lodge themselves in people's memories and perhaps, over time, influence how they understood the events that had occurred. He began, quietly, to compose a song about a young woman lost to circumstances beyond her control, about the injustice of a life constrained by others' will, about the nobility of resistance and the tragedy of powerlessness. The song did not name anyone or describe specific events, but those who knew the truth would recognize Catherine in its verses. Those who had been involved in her fate would understand that their actions had been observed and remembered. And those who listened without knowing the background would simply hear a beautiful, melancholic song about human suffering and dignity. The composition of this song consumed him in ways that his regular musical work typically did not. He worked on it through the autumn and into the winter, refining verses, adjusting melodies, attempting to balance the demands of artistic integrity with the political necessity of encoding dangerous truth in forms that were not immediately recognizable as threat. Margaret monitored his work with concern. "You're creating something that could bring you harm," she said, watching him practice in her tavern one evening. "Once that song exists and is performed publicly, it will be out there. You cannot control how people interpret it, what connections they make, what consequences your words might trigger." "I understand that," Thomas said. "Do you? Because I'm not certain you do. You seem to think that art provides some kind of protection, that creating beauty confers immunity from danger. It doesn't. All it does is make the danger more elegant." But even as Margaret warned him, Thomas understood that he had passed beyond the point where warning could turn him back. He had been pulled into something that exceeded his initial understanding when he had first agreed to speak with Father Oswald. He had been transformed by knowledge of injustice, and that transformation could not be undone through retreat or silence. The only path forward, inadequate as it was through artistic expression, through turning what he knew into something that could persist beyond his own efforts, something that could carry testimony even if it could not produce justice. By the time winter settled fully into the region, Thomas had completed the song. It was, he believed, the best work he had ever created, technically skilled, emotionally resonant, and carrying within its verses a truth that would be understood by some and missed by others. He prepared to perform it publicly, aware that this performance would mark a threshold in his own journey, that after he had sung this song before witnesses, everything would be different. The location he chose for the first public performance was deliberate. A gathering at a monastery some distance from Coventry during a feast day that would attract people from multiple regions and social standings. Father Oswald would be present. Margaret would attend. Various merchants and minor nobility would listen. The song would enter the collective memory of these diverse people, and through them, it would begin to circulate through the medieval world's informal networks of gossip and repetition. As Thomas stood in the refectory of the monastery, preparing to perform this song for the first time, he was aware of standing at a genuine threshold. He had moved from being a performer who observed injustice while maintaining distance from it, to being an investigator, attempting to understand specific wrongdoing, and now to being something closer to an artist witness who is attempting to transform private knowledge into public testimony. He was afraid, genuinely, profoundly afraid, but the fear seemed to him to be the appropriate response to what he was undertaking. The song, when he finally performed it, was received with a kind of quiet attention that suggested listeners sensed they were witnessing something of significance, even if they could not articulate precisely what that significance was. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the applause came, a pause that seemed to Thomas to contain some kind of acknowledgement of the weight he had just brought into the room. Afterward, Father Oswald approached him with tears in his eyes. "That was perfect," the priest said quietly. "You've done what I could not do. You've borne witness in a way that will endure, that will carry truth forward even if we cannot produce immediate justice. Thank you." But Thomas, watching the reactions of the various listeners, was not entirely certain that the significance he had tried to encode had been universally perceived. Some people seemed to have heard simply a beautiful song about loss. Others seemed to sense that something more was being said, though they might not have fully understood what. And a few, those who knew something of the truth of Catherine's situation, seemed to understand precisely what he was claiming and what truth he was attempting to preserve. The consequences of that first performance would not be immediately apparent, but the line had been crossed. The song existed now. It would be repeated, would travel from mouth to mouth, would acquire variations and interpretations. Thomas had stepped from the relative safety of silence and careful distance into the more exposed position of public testimony. And while the testimony was encoded and refracted through artistic form, it was testimony nonetheless, and it would carry consequences that he could not fully predict or control. The consequences of Thomas's public performance of the song emerged gradually, in the form of subtle shifts in how he was treated, and what opportunities became available to him. Within weeks, Certain households that had regularly hired him for performances began to cite scheduling conflicts or sudden changes in plans. Work that had once been reliable became sporadic. The network of innkeepers and merchants who had previously provided him with information and hospitality grew noticeably more cautious in their interactions with him. But the more significant consequence was the direct approach that came in late winter, a formal summons delivered by a man of evident rank, requesting that Thomas present himself at a particular location to meet with representatives of Lord Fairfax's interests. The message was phrased with sufficient courtesy to avoid being an outright threat, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. Thomas's presence was required, and his failure to appear would be interpreted as deliberate offense. He consulted with both Father Oswald and Margaret before responding to the summons. "It's a negotiation," Father Oswald said, his initial anxiety gradually transforming into something more calculated. "They're going to offer you something. Money, likely, or perhaps safe passage out of the region. They want you to understand that there are consequences to what you've done, but they're also offering you a graceful exit from the situation." "That sounds optimistic," Thomas said. "It could equally well be a setup, a way of isolating you where they can eliminate the problem directly." "Possible," Father Oswald acknowledged. "But if they wanted to simply kill you, they could do so more easily. The fact that they're arranging a formal meeting suggests they want to reach an accommodation of some kind. They're people of power. They prefer to purchase silence rather than enforce it through violence. Violence leaves traces and requires explanations. Money leaves only gratitude." Margaret was less optimistic. "Don't go," she said flatly. "Send a message declining the meeting. Leave the region tonight. This is your opportunity to actually escape before things become truly dangerous. If I don't go, I confirm that I'm aware of something significant and that I'm attempting to avoid confrontation because of that awareness," Thomas countered. "That might be worse than going and hearing what they have to say." "Possibly," Margaret said, "but at least you'd be alive. You could rebuild somewhere else. This investigation, this song, this commitment to bearing witness, it's all going to be for nothing if you get yourself killed." Thomas understood the force of Margaret's argument, but he also understood that some part of him, the part that had been awakened by Catherine's request for witness, could not retreat now. He was 33 years old. He had lived long enough to understand the consequences of his choices. He was choosing, nonetheless, to appear at the meeting. The location was neutral, a small monastery, the same one where he had first spoken extensively with Father Oswald, a place that carried the implicit protection of the Church. The representatives who met him were two men, one who appeared to be a lawyer or clerk of some kind, dressed in the manner of someone involved in administrative functions, and another who was identifiable by his bearing and dress as someone of minor noble rank, possibly a relation of Lord Fairfax, or perhaps a representative acting on behalf of another interested party. "You've created a delicate situation," the lawyer said, without preamble. "You've composed and publicly performed a song that, while it does not explicitly accuse anyone of wrongdoing, clearly references specific events and suggests that injustice has occurred. This song has begun to circulate. It is being repeated in various contexts. It is acquiring the status of a known piece, a composition that people associate with a particular interpretation of recent history. I've performed a song," Thomas said carefully. "The song describes events as I understand them. What people choose to believe about those events is their own responsibility. The song describes a young woman lost to circumstances beyond her control, the noble representative said. His accent suggested he came from a region farther south, possibly Aldwin's territories. The song implies that her loss was the result of deliberate action by someone in a position of power. The song has been heard by clergy, by merchants, by minor nobility. It is beginning to create questions in the minds of people who might not otherwise have questioned the official narrative of events. "I cannot control how people interpret my work," Thomas said. "No," the lawyer agreed, "but you can control whether that work continues to be performed, whether the song spreads further, whether it acquires additional authority through continued circulation." This is what we've come to discuss. What followed was, in essence, a negotiation. The representatives offered Thomas a substantial sum of money, enough to fund several years of comfortable living without the necessity of performance. They offered him safe passage to France or to other regions where the Fairfax family's reach was limited. They offered him the opportunity to resume his life as a performer in new locations, freed from the constraints and dangers of his current situation. In exchange, they asked for his commitment that he would not perform the song again in any public venue. They asked that he refrain from discussing the circumstances of Catherine's disappearance with anyone who might carry such information forward. They asked, essentially, for his silence. Not the passive silence of someone who does not speak, but the active silence of someone who has deliberately chosen not to share what he knows. "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked. "Then we move forward with the understanding that you have chosen to position yourself in opposition to people with significantly more power than you possess," the noble representative said. His tone was not threatening, simply factual. "The consequences of that opposition will unfold according to mechanisms that you may not anticipate or control. You may be harmed, directly or indirectly. People you care about may experience consequences. Your ability to continue your profession may be severely constrained. But all of this will be presented to any observer as the natural result of an individual of low station creating problems for people of higher station and facing the appropriate response." Thomas understood with absolute clarity what was being offered and what was being threatened. He was being given an exit that would preserve his life and his livelihood in exchange for the abandonment of what he had begun to understand as his responsibility. He was being offered comfort and security in exchange for becoming the kind of person who knew of injustice and did nothing about it, which had been his position for most of his adult life, until Catherine had changed something in him through her request for witness. "I need time to consider," he said. "You have until the new moon," the lawyer said. "By that time, you should provide us with your response. If your response is acceptable, arrangements will be made for your transport and your settlement. If your response is unacceptable, we will assume that you have chosen a different path, and consequences will follow accordingly." Thomas departed the monastery in a state of profound turmoil. He had been offered a genuine escape route from a situation that had become increasingly dangerous. He had been offered essentially the opportunity to resume the comfortable distance that had characterized most of his adult life. But the offer itself seemed to him to represent a kind of death, the death of the part of him that Catherine's encounter had awakened, the part that understood bearing witness as a form of moral action. He sought counsel from Father Oswald first, finding the priest in his small chamber at the monastery. "Take the money," Father Oswald said immediately.
Take the passage to France. Begin a new life. I'm serious, Thomas. This is not a matter where I believe you should maintain your position." "But the song," Thomas began. "The song exists," Father Oswald interrupted. "It has been performed. It has been heard. It has entered the world. The fact of its existence does not depend on your continued performance of it. Other people will learn it. Other people will perform it. Your role in creating it was important, but your role in perpetuating it is not necessary for the song to do its work." "So, I simply abandon the investigation?" "I allow the forces that killed Catherine to continue operating without further resistance from me?" "Yes," Father Oswald said, and the finality in his voice was striking. "You abandon the investigation because the investigation has reached its practical limits. You resist through the creation of the song, which was an act of genuine courage and significance. But now you need to understand that there are limits to what an individual can accomplish when opposed by structures of power. The wisdom lies in recognizing those limits and choosing to preserve your own existence rather than sacrificing it to an impossible struggle." Thomas left the priest and made his way to Margaret's tavern, arriving in the evening when the place was relatively quiet. He described the offer to her in detail, watching her expression shift from concern to something approaching grim satisfaction. "This is good news," she said. "This is your opportunity. This is what I've been hoping for since you first became entangled in this investigation. You can leave. You can take the money and establish yourself somewhere safe. You can resume being a functioning human being instead of someone consumed by a moral cause." "But Catherine," Thomas said. "Catherine is dead," Margaret said, not unkindly. "Her being dead is not changed by whether you accept this offer. What's changed is whether you continue to be alive. Take the money, Thomas. Go to France. Perform songs about love and adventure and the ordinary human experiences that audiences actually want to hear about. Live a life that isn't consumed by the attempt to avenge someone you barely knew." Over the following days, Thomas found himself moving through the region in a state of almost mechanical routine, performing at various venues, collecting payment, eating and sleeping, but not truly present in any of these activities. His mind was engaged in a kind of internal debate that seemed to have no resolution. Every argument for accepting the offer was balanced by an equally compelling argument for refusing it. Every practical consideration suggested that survival and comfort should take precedence over abstract notions of justice and bearing witness. And yet, having once been awakened to the reality of what those practical considerations actually meant, the abandonment of justice, the acceptance of corruption, the choice to be comfortable rather than to be good, he could not seem to make peace with them. It was Father Oswald who eventually provided the insight that resolved Thomas's internal conflict, though perhaps not in the way the priest had intended. The priest sought Thomas out at a market where he was performing, approaching him after a performance with news. "Catherine's father is asking questions," Father Oswald said quietly. "Significant questions, in formal contexts." He's apparently convinced that something was wrong about his daughter's disappearance, and he's been making inquiries through ecclesiastical channels. There's been pressure from the church on the local authorities to investigate. It's not everything. It's not going to result in anyone being definitively punished for what happened, but it's something. Your song seems to have planted seeds that are now beginning to grow in unexpected places. Thomas considered this information carefully. He realized that what had seemed like a complete failure of his investigation, the inability to produce proof, to demand justice, to compel action, had not been a complete failure at all. The song had done what art often does. It had carried truth forward, had made it available to people who might act on it in ways that the artist could not predict or control. Catherine's father, presumably having heard the song or heard of it through intermediaries, had been moved to ask questions that the official narrative had seemed to foreclose. "So the investigation continues," Thomas said, "not through us, but through other means, in ways we didn't control or even anticipate." "Yes," Father Oswald said, "that's exactly what's happening. Which means that what you've done, bearing witness through the song, has actually had effects. Not complete effects, not the kind of perfect justice that one might hope for, but real effects nonetheless." This understanding seemed to shift something in Thomas's internal calculus. He was not being asked to continue an investigation or to maintain a position against Lord Fairfax's representatives. He was being asked whether he could accept that his contribution to the pursuit of truth had been made, that it had had effects, and that continuing to maintain a public stance against corruption was not necessary in order for that contribution to continue doing its work. He made his decision. He returned to the appointed location at the new moon as instructed, and delivered his response to the representatives who had made the initial offer. But his response was neither simple acceptance nor simple refusal. Instead, it was a negotiation of his own. He agreed that he would cease performing the song publicly in venues where it might generate controversy or continue to raise questions about the Fairfax household. He agreed that he would not actively promote the song or discuss its origins or meanings with people inclined to spread such information. He agreed, in essence, to withdraw from the active investigation and from the active promotion of the narrative that the song represented. But he refused to accept payment for this silence, and he refused to flee the region or to abandon his profession. Instead, he negotiated for something else: the agreement that he would be left to continue his work as a performer without interference, that the representatives would cease their efforts to block his work or to generate hostility toward him among potential employers. He negotiated, in essence, for his continued existence as a functioning minstrel, not comfortable or prosperous, but free to work, to travel, to maintain his connections and his life. "Why would you refuse payment?" the lawyer asked, genuinely puzzled by Thomas's negotiating position. "Because accepting payment would transform me from someone who has made a choice based on principle into someone who has been purchased," Thomas said. "I'm not attempting to be virtuous about this. I'm simply understanding that there are different kinds of survival, and some of them cost more than others. I'm choosing a form of survival that I can live with." The representatives eventually agreed to Thomas's terms. It was, he understood, a reasonable compromise from their perspective. They had achieved their primary goal. The public performance of the song would cease, the active investigation would end, and the narrative about Catherine's disappearance would be allowed to fade into obscurity. Thomas's continued presence in the region, now that he had agreed to silence, was a relatively minor concern. As winter deepened and gave way to spring, Thomas found himself in a curious position. He had, in some sense, lost the immediate battle. The song would no longer be performed publicly. The investigation had been halted. Catherine's death would likely remain unavenged. But he had also preserved something that felt important: his own integrity.
his ability to continue functioning as an artist and a witness, his refusal to allow himself to be completely absorbed into the corruption that surrounded him. The song, though no longer performed by Thomas, had begun to acquire a kind of independent life. It was learned by other musicians. It was performed at venues he did not attend and in contexts he did not control. It had taken on variations and reinterpretations. It had become something that belonged less to him and more to the collective memory of the region. A piece that carried truth about Catherine without being explicitly about Catherine. A witness that would endure beyond his own continued effort to maintain it. Father Oswald had been transferred, not as punishment, but through the quiet mechanisms by which the Church occasionally moved priests who would become too closely associated with controversial matters. He was sent to a monastery far to the north, a kind of exile that was also a form of protection. But before he left, he and Thomas met one final time. "You did the right thing," the priest said, "both by creating the song and by withdrawing from the active investigation. You've learned what took me much longer to understand, that there are different forms of resistance, and the most effective resistance is often the kind that doesn't announce itself as resistance." "I'm not certain I've accomplished anything," Thomas said. "Catherine is still dead. Lord Fairfax still holds power. The corruption still operates." "Yes," Father Oswald said, "but now Catherine is remembered. Not in official records, not in the formal structures of law and justice, but in memory, in art, in the conversations of ordinary people. That's not nothing. That's actually quite substantial, if you understand the full weight of what it means." Thomas found himself alone, in some sense, with the burden of his knowledge. Margaret continued to provide him with the friendship and counsel that had sustained him through the investigation. But she understood, as he did, that the period of active engagement had passed. He had made his choices. He had borne his witness. And now he needed to learn to live with the consequences and the limitations of that witness. What emerged from this period was a particular kind of peace. Not the peace of someone who had achieved justice or solved problems, but the peace of someone who had acted according to his understanding and had learned to accept that action often produces incomplete results. Thomas continued to perform, continued to travel his familiar circuits, continued to be the careful observer and the skilled entertainer that he had always been. But underneath the performance and the careful distance, something had changed. He now carried within himself the knowledge of genuine injustice, genuine wrongdoing, genuine suffering. And that knowledge, integrated into his understanding of the world, became part of how he moved through that world. The threat of violence had receded. The danger had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable, a kind of underlying tension that could be lived with rather than something that demanded immediate action or response. Thomas had learned the hard way that bearing witness was often the only form of action available to someone in his position, and that this witness, though it might feel inadequate in the moment, could carry significance that only became apparent through time and distance. News travels slowly through medieval England, moving through the same networks that carry merchants and messages, spreading through gossip and repetition until what was once local knowledge becomes the kind of story that reaches distant ears, transformed by distance and retelling.
It was through this gradual percolation of information that Thomas, traveling his familiar routes in the months following his settlement with Lord Fairfax's representatives, began to hear fragments of reports that suggested his song had done more work than he had anticipated. A merchant passing through Coventry mentioned, in casual conversation, that he had heard of a formal investigation being initiated into the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of a ward from a noble household in the region. The investigation, he indicated, had been prompted by inquiries from the young woman's father, who had apparently become convinced that the official narrative of her elopement was incomplete. Church authorities, the merchant said, were involved in the inquiry, which suggested that ecclesiastical power was being brought to bear on the matter. Margaret, who had been listening to this exchange while serving ale to the assembled patrons, caught Thomas's eye across the tavern with an expression that suggested both vindication and caution. Later, when the crowd had dispersed, she shared what else she had heard through her extensive network of connections. The girl's father, Catherine's father, he apparently heard your song performed at a gathering in a town not far from here. Or at least, he heard of it through someone who had heard it. The song got into his head, made him wonder about things he might have otherwise accepted. He started asking questions in formal contexts through the church, pressing for investigation. It's taken months, but the pressure seems to be producing results. What kind of results? Thomas asked. Slow results, Margaret said. Nothing public yet, nothing that would constitute proof or lead to accusation. But inquiries are being made, servants are being questioned, records are being examined. Your old friend, Lord Fairfax, is apparently becoming increasingly anxious about what might be discovered. Over the following months, Thomas found himself receiving more detailed information through various channels. A monk who stayed at an inn where Thomas occasionally performed mentioned in conversation that he had heard of an inquiry being conducted by church authorities into the finances of Lord Fairfax's household. Another traveler spoke of seeing increased activity at the Fairfax estate, unusual meetings, servants being questioned, records being organized and examined, as though someone was attempting to establish a clear accounting of the household's operations. What was emerging, piece by piece, was a picture of gradual movement towards some form of accounting, though whether that accounting would result in genuine consequences remained entirely uncertain. Thomas understood that investigations could be initiated and then quietly abandoned, that pressure could be applied and then withdrawn, that the structures of power often arranged themselves to protect those within them, regardless of the evidence of wrongdoing. It was in late autumn, more than a year after his initial settlement with Fairfax's representatives, that a stranger appeared at one of Thomas's performances. The man was clearly of some minor noble standing. His clothing and bearing marked him as someone of authority and education. But his face was unfamiliar to Thomas, and his manner suggested he was from a region some distance away. After the performance concluded, the man approached Thomas directly. "You don't know me," he said. "But I know who you are, and I know about the song you created. I'm William Ashford, Catherine's father. I wanted to meet you and to thank you for what you did." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a kind of recognition that the consequences of his actions were becoming tangible, taking form in the person of a man whose daughter was dead and whose grief had apparently been transformed into action through the catalyst of Thomas's song. "I'm sorry for your loss," Thomas said, the courtesy automatic but also genuine. "Thank you," William Ashford said. I'm still learning to live with it. For a long time I believed what I was told, that Catherine ran away, that she eloped with some unsuitable man, that she had brought shame on herself and her family through her own recklessness. It was a story that hurt, but it was a story I could accommodate because it suggested that Catherine had made a choice, however foolish. "But you no longer believe that?" Thomas asked carefully. "No," William said. "After hearing your song, after understanding that someone outside my family, someone who had met Catherine only briefly, had felt moved to bear witness to what happened to her, I began to wonder whether the official narrative was actually true. I began to ask questions that I should have asked immediately after her disappearance. And the more I asked, the more I came to understand that something was genuinely wrong about the story I had been told." William Ashford proceeded to explain that he had been conducting his own investigation, using his position as a man of means and some standing to press for formal inquiries into Catherine's disappearance. He had convinced church authorities to take the matter seriously. He had gathered testimony from servants who had been willing to speak, from people who had observed unusual circumstances in the period leading up to Catherine's disappearance. What had emerged from this investigation was not certainty. The full truth of what had happened to Catherine remained elusive, but substantial evidence that the official narrative was false. Evidence suggested that Catherine had been pregnant. Evidence suggested that her pregnancy had become a liability for her uncle because it threatened an important political alliance. Evidence suggested that extraordinary measures had been taken to conceal or manage the situation. "But I cannot prove that she was killed," William said. "The body has never been found. No one who knows what actually happened is willing to testify publicly. Lord Fairfax has used his position and his connections to prevent the investigation from moving forward, to discredit the people who have spoken. But the fact of the investigation itself, the fact that questions have been raised and are being documented, that matters. It means Catherine's disappearance is not simply accepted as resolved. It means the truth, whatever it is, will not be completely buried." "What will happen now?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," William said. "Fairfax may face some consequences, loss of standing, possible ecclesiastical penalties, the knowledge that people understand his character and his actions. Or he may use his power to weather this investigation and move forward with his life essentially unchanged. Justice is uncertain and often incomplete. But at least the attempt at justice is being made. At least her death is not being passed over in silence." As William Ashford departed, leaving Thomas with gratitude and with a kind of closure that seemed both genuine and temporary, Thomas found himself thinking about the nature of witness and the nature of justice in a world where power was distributed so unevenly. His song had not produced definitive proof. It had not resulted in a trial or in clear punishment of the guilty. But it had changed the trajectory of events in subtle but real ways. It had moved Catherine's father to action. It had prompted investigations. It had created space for truth to be spoken, even if that truth could not be fully enforced. Over the following months, additional reports reached Thomas regarding the ongoing investigation and its effects. He learned that Lord Fairfax's reputation had been damaged, that his position in the social hierarchy of the region had been weakened, that his financial difficulties had been exacerbated by the need to conduct legal defense and to manage the ecclesiastical inquiries. He learned that a man matching the description of the steward Richard had departed the region. His cottage had been sold,
and he had apparently taken service with Aldwyn's household far to the south. He learned, through Father Oswald's letters, that the investigation had eventually moved into an official phase, with formal questioning and documentation, though the investigation had been deliberately slowed and constrained by various obstacles placed by those connected to Fairfax's interests. The priest wrote, "Justice is being pursued, though slowly and imperfectly. That is perhaps the best we can hope for in a world where those with power have multiple means of resisting accountability. But the pursuit itself matters. The fact that questions continue to be asked matters." Thomas continued his work, but something in him had shifted again. He had learned, through the concrete example of Catherine's father's investigation, that his actions had effects that extended beyond what he could control or anticipate. The song he had created, which had seemed to him at the time to be an inadequate response to genuine injustice, had proven to be more powerful than he had understood. It had moved people. It had prompted action. It had contributed to a process that, while incomplete and uncertain, was at least a genuine attempt at accountability. During this period, Thomas found himself gradually acquiring a particular kind of reputation among certain circles. He became known, among clergy and educated merchants who moved through the region, as someone who had composed and performed the song about Catherine, though the song's title and Catherine's full name were often obscured or altered in the retelling. He became known, among people who paid attention to such things, as someone who had borne witness to injustice and had found a way to make that witness public. This reputation both helped and hindered his work. On the one hand, it meant that certain patrons, clergy particularly, and certain merchants who valued justice and truth, sought him out specifically for performances, wanted to hear him play, treated him with a particular respect that reflected their understanding of what he had done. On the other hand, it meant that other patrons avoided him, concerned that association with someone known for public criticism of the powerful might bring unwanted attention to themselves. The calculation that Thomas had to make, repeatedly, was how much to lean into this reputation and how much to resist it. He understood that the reputation was itself a kind of power. It gave him standing and protection in certain contexts, but he also understood that leaning too heavily on it, using it as a platform for continued criticism or investigation, would likely bring renewed attention from the people whose actions he had questioned. He chose a kind of balance. He did not shy away from the reputation, and he allowed people to understand that he was the creator of the song about Catherine. But he also deliberately refrained from capitalizing on that reputation by performing the song publicly, or by encouraging further investigation into the Fairfax household. He had made his statement through the song. He had borne his witness, and now he was learning to live with the consequences of those acts without adding to them. Margaret observed this balance with approval. "You've learned something," she said to him one evening. "You've learned the difference between bearing witness and pursuing justice. You understand now that they're not the same thing, that one is within your capacity and the other is not." That's wisdom, even if it's not the kind of wisdom most people celebrate. It was during this period that Thomas also became aware that Father Oswald's transfer had been formalized. The priest had been relocated permanently to a monastery in the north, a placement that seemed to be understood by those in the know as a kind of exile. Thomas attempted to maintain correspondence with the priest, and letters did eventually reach him, carried by traveling monks and merchants. In one such letter, Father Oswald wrote, I'm grateful for what we did together, for the investigation, and for the song you created. I'm also grateful that we withdrew when we did, that we didn't sacrifice ourselves pursuing something that we could not fully control. There is a time for action and a time for acceptance.
We both learned that distinction through difficulty, but we learned it. Another letter, arriving in the second year after Thomas's settlement with Fairfax's representatives, contained news that was both satisfying and unsettling. Father Oswald reported that he had encountered a traveling physician who had been present at the Fairfax household years earlier when Catherine's situation had been developing. The physician, speaking under conditions of confidence, had indicated that he had been called to attend Catherine during a medical crisis, apparently the result of a failed attempt at terminating her pregnancy. The physician had provided treatment, and Catherine had survived the immediate crisis. But the physician had also been paid a substantial sum to remain silent about the circumstances of Catherine's treatment, and had been informed, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that speaking about what he had witnessed would result in consequences. The physician had departed the region not long after this incident, and had spent years in service to various lords in other territories, moving frequently, as though attempting to ensure that he did not remain in any location long enough for Lord Fairfax to maintain leverage over him. But now, years later, he had apparently decided that the statute of limitations on his silence had expired, or that his conscience could no longer tolerate the knowledge he carried. This suggests, Father Oswald wrote, that Catherine may have survived what happened to her longer than we believed, or that she may not have died from the complications of her pregnancy at all. It opens new questions about when and how she actually died, and whether what happened to her was the result of medical complications or of something more deliberate. The investigation has this information now, though whether it will produce any concrete results remains uncertain. But I wanted you to know that your song prompted not merely Catherine's father to ask questions, but apparently prompted others, in scattered locations, to speak truths that they had been keeping silent about for years. Thomas received this information with a complicated mix of emotions. The possibility that Catherine might have survived longer than he had assumed, that the truth of what had happened to her was even more obscure and more troubling than he had believed, suggested that the injustice was even greater than he had originally understood. But it also reinforced what he was gradually learning about the nature of witness and truth in a world where power operated through concealment and the management of information. By the time Thomas reached his mid-30s, the acute period of crisis and investigation had passed. The Fairfax household had weathered the scrutiny, though not without cost. Lord Fairfax's reputation had been damaged. His financial position had been weakened. But he had not been removed from power, and the full truth of what had happened to Catherine had not been established. Catherine herself remained absent from the world, her death or disappearance never fully accounted for, her body never recovered, her fate never officially resolved. And yet Thomas understood the fact that the question had been asked, the fact that her disappearance had not simply been accepted and filed away as resolved, constituted a form of resistance and a form of justice, however incomplete. The structures of power had been forced to acknowledge, at least privately, that people were watching, that people questioned official narratives, that injustice did not pass entirely unnoticed. Thomas's song had functioned not as a trumpet call to action or as a direct accusation,
but as something more subtle and perhaps more durable. A question mark inserted into the official record, a reminder that the world's official version of events might not be its true version, a testimony to the existence of someone who had been erased from the formal narrative. The song had not changed everything, but it had changed something, and that something, while small and incomplete, was real. The tavern was the same as it had always been, the timber frames settling further into age, the hearth producing more smoke than seemed necessary, the ale served in cups worn smooth by decades of hands. Margaret was older now, her hair entirely gray, her movements slower, but no less precise in their efficiency. She moved behind the counter with the ease of someone who had been doing the same work in the same space for so long that the work had become something close to meditation.
Thomas sat in his usual place by the fire, his lute resting against the wall beside him. He was 39 years old, though the number itself seemed to him oddly irrelevant. What mattered was not the count of years, but what the years had accumulated in his hands, his voice, his understanding of the world. His hair was beginning to gray at the temples. His fingers, still capable of producing music with precision and control, bore the accumulated calluses and minor scars of 20 years of performance. His face had developed the particular kind of weathering that came from constant travel and exposure to the elements, combined with years of careful observation of the world around him. The evening was quiet. A few patrons sat scattered through the tavern, a merchant or two, a couple of local men whose work had concluded for the day, a young person whose exact occupation was unclear, but whose manner suggested education of some kind. The fire provided warmth against the autumn chill that was beginning to settle into the evenings. Outside, the sounds of the town were muffled by distance and by the heavy wooden door of the tavern. A young person, a student, Thomas judged, or perhaps an apprentice to a clerk, approached him hesitantly. "Are you the minstrel?" the young man asked. "The one who composed the song about the lost young woman?" Thomas considered how to respond to this question. It was not asked in a threatening manner, and there was genuine curiosity in the young man's tone. Still, Thomas had learned caution about how he acknowledged his role in that particular song's composition. "I've composed many songs," Thomas said finally. "Which one are you thinking of?" "There's a song that's been performed around here. I've heard it a few times, though not for several years now. It's about a girl who disappears, about the injustice of her situation, about how she couldn't control her own fate." "I heard someone mention that you wrote it, and I wanted to know if that was true." Margaret, who was close enough to hear this exchange, set down the cup she had been washing and gave Thomas a particular look, an expression that suggested both amusement and something like affection. "I composed a song like that," Thomas acknowledged, "a long time ago. It was prompted by events that seemed to me to warrant bearing witness." "Do you still perform it?" the young man asked. "Not publicly," Thomas said. "The song was appropriate for a particular moment, and that moment has largely passed. I perform other work now." The young man seemed disappointed by this answer, but not surprised, as though he had suspected that the song might no longer be available to be heard. He thanked Thomas politely and returned to his table, where he was apparently engaged in some form of written work that required his attention. After the young man had moved away, Margaret brought Thomas a cup of hot wine, though he had not requested one. "He would have been satisfied if you had performed it," she said. "People are hungry for that song. It's become a kind of legend. The song that made Lord Fairfax nervous. The song that prompted investigation into corruption. But you already know that. Yes, Thomas said, and that's precisely why I don't perform it publicly anymore. The song has acquired more significance than I'm comfortable with it having. It's become detached from its origins, from the specific injustice it was created to address. It's become a general statement about the arbitrariness of power, which is true but also incomplete. I'd rather leave it as something that exists in memory and rumor than to keep performing it and have it continue to accumulate meanings I don't fully control. Margaret settled herself into the chair across from Thomas. She had earned the privilege, through decades of work, of occasionally sitting when her duties permitted. "You've changed," she said. "From the young man who first arrived here, desperate to bear witness to an injustice. You've learned something about the limits of bearing witness." "I've learned that bearing witness and pursuing justice are not the same thing," Thomas said. "I've learned that one is within my capacity and one is not. I've learned that the most durable form of testimony is often the kind that doesn't announce itself as testimony, that doesn't insist on immediate results or recognition." The song did its work. Catherine's father was moved to ask questions. An investigation happened, incomplete as it was. And now the song exists in a different form, not as something I perform, but as something that people have learned from others, something that carries truth in ways I can no longer control or even fully understand. "That sounds like wisdom," Margaret said, "though it also sounds like you've made peace with inadequacy." "Perhaps," Thomas agreed. "Or perhaps I've simply understood that most of what we accomplish in this world is inadequate. We do our best. We bear witness as we're able. We create beauty and share truth as we can manage. And then we accept that the world continues to turn, that injustice persists, that not every wrong is corrected. That acceptance doesn't make us complicit. It makes us realistic." The tavern settled back into its quiet evening rhythm. Thomas eventually retrieved his lute and performed for the assembled patrons, not the old song, but other pieces from his vast repertoire. Songs about travel and homecoming, about love and loss, about the particular beauty of ordinary human experience. He performed well, as he always did, with the skill that came from decades of practice and the understanding of how music operated on listeners' emotions and memories. As the evening progressed toward night, the patrons gradually dispersed. The merchant departed first, followed by the local men whose day work had exhausted them enough that further entertainment held limited appeal. The young student remained longest, writing by the light of a candle, apparently engaged in important work that could not wait. Eventually, even he collected his materials and departed, leaving Thomas and Margaret alone in the tavern as the fire burned down toward embers. "How much longer do you think you'll continue?" Margaret asked, as she began the work of closing down the tavern for the evening. "How much longer will you travel and perform?" Thomas considered the question seriously. He had been asking himself similar things with increasing frequency as he moved through his late 30s. His body remained generally functional, but he was aware of a gradual accumulation of small ailments. His knees complained on cold mornings. His voice was sometimes hoarse after particularly demanding performances. His general stamina was not quite what it had been in his younger years. "I don't know," he said finally. "As long as I'm able, I suppose. As long as there are people willing to pay for performances and audiences willing to listen. I have no alternative profession, no secure position waiting for me. I've never accumulated enough wealth to retire. Performance is what I know how to do, and it's provided me with a livelihood that,
while modest, has been adequate. "You could stay here," Margaret said. She said this as though the idea had occurred to her recently, as though she had been considering whether to offer it. "I'm getting older, as you can see."
"The tavern will need management eventually. You could perform here regularly, could have a home base instead of constant travel. It would be less lonely." Thomas was genuinely moved by the offer, not because staying would be comfortable. He knew that managing a tavern was hard work, and that comfort was not the substance of Margaret's life, but because it represented genuine affection, a recognition of the connection that had formed between them over the decades of his regular visits to her establishment. "I appreciate that," he said carefully, "and I care about you enough to take the offer seriously. But I think I need to continue traveling. There's something in me that still needs the road, that still needs the movement and the change and the constant navigation of new circumstances. If I stopped traveling now, I think I would become bitter in ways that I haven't quite managed to become, despite everything. And I wouldn't want to bring that bitterness into this space that has been a refuge for me." "You're a fool," Margaret said, but she said it with affection. "But you've always been a particular kind of fool, and I've come to appreciate that quality in you. So I won't push the offer, but know that it stands. If the road becomes too much, or if circumstances change, you have a place here." Thomas and Margaret spent the remainder of the evening in companionable quiet, the kind of silence that comes only from genuine familiarity and acceptance. They did not need to fill the space with constant conversation. They simply existed together, two people who had moved through decades of the world's complexity and had emerged with some capacity for peace, if not exactly happiness. In the weeks that followed, Thomas gradually shifted the geography of his travels. He spent somewhat less time on the long circuits that had defined his earlier years, and somewhat more time in the familiar towns and villages where he was well established. He moved more slowly, taking longer intervals between performances to recover from the wear and tear of travel. He began, almost without consciously deciding to do so, to transition from being a performer who moved relentlessly forward to being a performer who was gradually settling into a more stable pattern. The song about Catherine continued to circulate, sometimes attributed to him, and sometimes attributed to various other musicians who had learned it and now claimed it as their own creation. Thomas encountered versions of it that bore little resemblance to the original. Melodies altered, lyrics changed to fit different musical traditions, the meaning shifted by different contexts and different performers. He observed these transformations with a kind of detached interest, understanding that this was the natural fate of any cultural artifact that achieved genuine circulation. The song had become public property, and it was no longer his responsibility to maintain its original form or meaning. Several years after the initial investigation into Catherine's disappearance, Thomas encountered Father Oswald again, not in person, but through a letter that traveled an extraordinarily complex route before finally reaching him. The priest had apparently heard that Thomas was still performing, and he wanted to communicate something that he felt had become clear only with the passage of time. "I've been reflecting on what happened to us, on the investigation we conducted together, on the consequences that followed," Father Oswald wrote, in Latin that was careful and deliberate. "I've come to believe that we were correct to withdraw when we did, not because the pursuit of truth was wrong, but because we each needed to understand the limits of what an individual could accomplish against structures of power. I've also come to believe that your song accomplished more than either of us could have anticipated.
Not because it produced perfect justice, it didn't, but because it demonstrated that truth could be carried forward through art, through beauty, through forms that couldn't be completely controlled or suppressed. I wanted you to know that I believe what you did mattered, even though it may not have felt like it mattered at the time, even though the results were so incomplete and uncertain. Thomas received this letter during a quiet period when he was staying in Coventry, resting between performances. He read it multiple times, sitting by Margaret's fire, considering the priest's assessment of their shared experience. He found himself in agreement with much of what Father Oswald had written, though he would have amended some of it. The priest had learned to see the investigation and the song as a form of success, even in their incompleteness. Thomas had learned something slightly different. He had learned to accept incompleteness itself as a kind of truth, to understand that the world operated through fragments and partial achievements, rather than through clear resolutions and definitive justice. As Thomas moved through his late 30s and approached 40, he noticed a shift in how people responded to his performances. He was no longer simply a skilled entertainer, whose primary function was to provide temporary distraction. He had acquired something approaching the status of a tradition. People came to hear him not only for the quality of his music, but also because his presence represented a connection to a particular history, a particular place, a particular way of understanding the world through artistic performance. He was invited to perform at a formal gathering by the bishop of a nearby diocese, a gesture that suggested the church's recognition of his status, and perhaps also its understanding of his role in the investigation that had prompted accountability within the Fairfax household. The performance was conducted in a cathedral, before an audience of clergy and educated merchants, and it consisted entirely of the older, safer pieces from his repertoire. But the fact that he had been invited suggested that his bearing of witness had not gone unnoticed or unappreciated by people in positions of power. It was after this performance that a young woman approached him, a woman who introduced herself as the niece of Catherine's cousin on her mother's side. She had been a child when Catherine disappeared, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to have been shaped by the event. Now, years later, she wanted to thank Thomas for having created the song. "My family has never known the full truth about what happened to Catherine," the young woman said. "But because of your song, because of the investigation it prompted, we know that the official story was false. We know that Catherine's death or disappearance was not simply an act of God or the result of her own recklessness. We know that people were involved, that choices were made, and that knowing matters. It doesn't make the loss less painful, but it means that Catherine is not simply blamed for her own fate. It means she is acknowledged as a person who was wronged." Thomas found this gratitude both touching and complicated. It suggested that his artistic creation had had real effects on real people, that it had contributed to something approaching justice, however incomplete. But it also suggested that the song had become something other than what he had intended. It had become a means of redemption for Catherine's family, a way of rewriting her story from one of shame to one of victimhood and injustice. He was not certain whether this transformation represented something good or whether it was simply another layer of narrative construction layered atop the unknowable truth of Catherine's actual fate. What he understood was that the truth, the actual, complete truth of what had happened to Catherine, had probably died with the people who had been directly involved in those events. Catherine's father was now an old man, if he was alive at all. Lord Fairfax had apparently aged into a kind of respected irrelevance. His reputation damaged, but his essential position maintained. The servants who had known what actually happened had either died or carried their knowledge into silence. The physician who had provided medical care was somewhere far away, his testimony offered years after the fact, unable to establish definitive proof of anything. And yet, the truth had persisted in a different form, not as definitive fact, but as a kind of collective understanding that the official narrative was incomplete, that injustice had occurred, that bearing witness to that injustice mattered. The song had been the vehicle for this understanding, carrying it forward through forms that could not be completely suppressed or controlled. On a winter evening near the end of Thomas's 39th year, he sat alone in Margaret's tavern after the last patrons had departed. The fire was burning down toward embers, and the room was settling into the particular kind of quiet that comes at the edge of night. Thomas's lute rested beside him, and his hands were still bearing the faint marks of calluses that had become a permanent feature of his body after nearly 20 years of constant performance. He thought about the path his life had taken, from a merchant's son, learning in secret, to a skilled performer navigating the hierarchies of medieval society, from a careful observer maintaining distance from injustice, to someone who had allowed himself to be drawn into bearing witness to that injustice, from a performer who thought only of technical excellence, to an artist who understood that beauty could carry truth, that form could contain meaning beyond its immediate aesthetic appeal. He understood that he would likely not see definitive justice for Catherine. He understood that Lord Fairfax would probably live out his life without facing formal punishment, that the full truth of what had happened would likely remain obscure. He understood that in a world governed by structures of power, the powerless, whether they were peasants without property, women without control over their own fates, or minstrels without status or resources, faced severely limited options for demanding accountability. But he also understood that the attempt at accountability mattered, that the bearing of witness mattered, that the creation of beauty and truth in forms that could not be completely controlled mattered, not because it changed everything, but because it changed something, and something was not nothing. The fire burned down further, and Margaret appeared at the edge of the tavern's main room, preparing to close for the night. She moved with the efficiency of decades, extinguishing candles, securing the door, attending to the small routines that concluded each day's work. When she noticed Thomas still seated by the fire, she paused. "You're thinking too much again," she said, as she had said to him countless times over the years. "Your audience doesn't pay you to think. They pay you to provide the feeling that thinking is possible, that the world makes sense, that suffering has meaning." "Perhaps," Thomas said, "or perhaps I'm finally understanding what I've been doing all along, which is thinking in the form of music, bearing testimony through the voice. The audience doesn't pay for thinking directly, but they benefit from having someone available who is willing to do the thinking, to carry the weight of trying to make sense of the world, and then to share that attempted sense-making through performance." Margaret settled herself into the chair across from him.
for what had become a customary end-of-evening conversation. "You've aged well," she said. "Not handsome, necessarily, you've never been that, but you've developed something that makes people trust you, that makes them believe you have something worth hearing. That's a gift." "Or a curse," Thomas said lightly. "Those are often the same thing," Margaret replied. They sat together as the fire burned down to ash, two people who had come to understand something about the nature of survival and meaning in a world that offered neither perfect justice nor complete understanding. Outside, the medieval world continued its relentless operations. Nobles exercising power, peasants laboring under constraint, the church maintaining its structures, the merchants calculating their profits. All the vast machinery of hierarchy and injustice turning as it had always turned. But in this small space, in this tavern that had become a kind of home, Thomas had learned to make peace with what he could accomplish and could not accomplish. He had learned that witnessing was a form of action, that beauty could carry truth, that the incomplete and inadequate response to injustice was often all that was available and yet was sometimes sufficient. The road would continue to call him. He would continue to travel for a few more years, performing his music, maintaining his networks, sharing the accumulated wisdom of his experience with new audiences. But something in his relationship to the road had changed. He was no longer running from or toward anything in particular. He was simply moving through the world with open eyes, ready to observe and to bear witness, ready to create beauty and to speak truth when circumstances allowed it. The song about Catherine would continue to circulate in various forms, transformed by different performers and different contexts, carrying forward a truth that was incomplete but real. The investigation into Lord Fairfax's household had concluded years ago with results that satisfied no one completely, but that at least acknowledged that injustice had occurred. Catherine herself remained absent from the world, her fate a mixture of fact and speculation, her memory carried forward by those who had loved her, and by the stranger who had promised to remember her, and who had kept that promise in the form of art. As the night deepened and Margaret finally rose to complete her closing routines, Thomas remained by the dying fire, his lute near at hand, his body tired, but his mind relatively at peace. He had done what he could do. He had made his choices. He had lived with the consequences. And he had survived, not merely physically, but spiritually intact, still capable of creating beauty, still willing to bear witness, still able to find meaning in a world that offered meaning only to those patient enough and courageous enough to search for it persistently. The future remained uncertain, as it always had, as it always would. But Thomas had learned to make peace with uncertainty. He had learned that certainty was often simply the refuge of those too frightened or too invested to look clearly at the world. And he had learned that living well meant learning to live with questions, with incompleteness, with the persistent hope that bearing witness might matter even when its effects were not visible or immediate. The embers glowed softly, and beyond them lay the rest of his life, uncertain, unfinished, but still containing the possibility of beauty, still containing the possibility that one person's careful attention to truth and justice might change something, might create ripples that extended far beyond what he could anticipate or control. And with that understanding, Thomas sat quietly and waited for morning,
when the road would call again, and he would answer as he had always answered, with skill, with integrity, and with the quiet courage of someone committed to bearing witness to the world as it truly was.